Welcome to this conversation where we should be talking about the earlier history of the Roman Republic. And I'm joined by Marcus. How are you?
Thank you.
Pyrrhus Person X, aka IronAgeAgricvltvalist. How are you doing?
Yes. Very good, thank you. As always, we get to talk about my favourite subjects. We obviously last year we canvassed Byzantium and a complicated period of Byzantine history, and you sort of asked me, how did the theme system and how did the Komnenians, come to pass? And it's like, let's start with, Heraclius and the Persian-Roman War, and here we are.
So the early Republic is a period that a lot of people don't know about, even people that are fans of Roman history. I mean, I know for a fact that when I did my undergrad in classical civilizations, even at that point I knew very little. And even after, I actually got most of my knowledge afterwards, reading around it years later. A lot of courses, they don't expect you to know about the wars of expansion in any real detail. So it's good for people to learn about, I think.
Absolutely.
And they're great stories.
Absolutely, and there's sort of two aspects to that sort of equation that are worth considering. And one is that what's intriguing is that for anyone who's studied, say, ancient Hellenic history, or what we might even call like the tail end of Greek mythology, because the sort of Trojan War there's that blurred sort of middle ground between it being historical, essentially, the start point of Greek history, but it also being mythological insofar that, there's the intervention of, the gods, and you sort of have these, quasi-mythological figures in the form of, Hector and Achilles and Ajax and Odysseus, and then, the Odyssey being like an addendum to the Iliad, and, Odysseus being 25 years to make ways back to Ithaca and all that sort of stuff. It is that middle ground between what is history and what is myth. And the foundations of Rome, the apocryphal date being 753 BC, there's sort of two elements of this foundation story. One obviously ties in with Aeneas being a survivor of Troy, and the war within, between the Greeks and the Trojans on the outside of their city, and Aeneas being the so-called inheritor of the Trojan legacy, and sort of them making their way to what we now understand to be Rome and Italy, and then
so
of course
this is the story of the Aeneid, Virgil's Aeneid.
And Virgil's Aeneid, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and sort of it being a in some ways the story of the survival of the Trojans sort of ties in with the birth of Rome.
So I had to do that at A level. At A level, I did the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. So I think a lot of people not a lot of people, but some ancient history fans, they'll know the Aeneid, they know the story of Aeneas and stuff like that, and they know Romulus and Remus, and then it's a bit blank for a few hundred years.
Yes, exactly.
But yeah, I mean, we could talk just for hours just about Aeneas.
Yeah, and like you got to think like Dido and the Queen of Carthage, and how every great historical story somehow also happens to be a love story, and often
he's got his own Odyssey, isn't he?
It is in essence, and then of course like what kind of story, a love story, is there without a scorned woman, and how in essence the separation of Aeneas and Dido becomes the genesis of what would later become the rivalry between Rome and Carthage with the Punic Wars, which sort of ends up being like the bookend of this discussion today.
Well, it must be a very deliberate decision by Virgil to include Dido, who's almost certainly fictional, right? Is that right?
Well, there is, at least to my knowledge, there's sort of like some historical, what do you call it? Not so much evidence, but there's, you could follow the history of the idea that I can't remember if it was Byblos or Tyre, which of the Phoenician cities it is, but the expulsion of a princess.
Oh, okay.
And essentially a coup d'etat by her brother, and so this because it also ties in to some degree with the foundation of Carthage, and there's a sort of that mythos of a local Berber king, if you could call, if the word Berber is correct, but like a local North African sort of chieftain, let's say, saying, you may settle your people here if you can cover a surface area with the hide of an oxen, and then it's sort of like she cuts it so thinly that she makes like meters upon like hundreds and hundreds of meters of length, and then that becomes the foundation area of Carthage, and the king kind of has to abide by his word, and whether how much of that is apocryphal and true. I mean, there's always, again, like what I said about the Trojan War, you have this sort of interplay and crossover between what is myth and what is history. But at some point, obviously, Carthage is founded as a colony of Phoenicia, and one is sort of a bit of a rare case. Carthage, in fact, you could say, supersedes the great Phoenician cities of Byblos, Tyre, Acre.
Right. Yeah. I wonder if the recording artist Dido is a massive Virgil fan.
Who knows?
Who knows? Anyway, who cares about that?
Yeah.
So Aeneas.
Eminem feet Carthage, you know.
Yeah. So I don't know how long we can't really spend too much time on that, but there's just he fights Turnus, isn't it? It's been a long time since I read the Aeneid, but he ends up fighting. I think it's a Latin chieftain called Turnus, and anyway, it's his son Ascanius, is it? God, I didn't think we'd be talking about Virgil. I didn't think we'd be talking about
Neither
the
did I
Aeneid
actually,
much
so
today.
I haven't done that for my notes either.
So there's that story, and he found Alba Longa, or the Romulus and Remus story.
You beat me to it, yeah.
With the suckling of the she-wolves. Thrown down the Tiber, found at the bottom of one of the 7 hills of Rome. Is it the Capitoline Hill? Being suckled by a she-wolf and then saved by a shepherd. And they grow up and...
2 brothers quarrel and...
Quarrel over the pomerium, over exactly where the settlement should be. And Romulus kills Remus and becomes the first king of Rome. And that starts the period of the regnal period of Rome, where there's supposed to have been 7 kings. I don't know if I want to say a little bit about that, but anyway, that ends in, 508, 509 with Superbus, Tarquinius Superbus?
Yeah, I was gonna actually sort of touch on them, because I mean we have our kings. You know, we have Romulus obviously becomes, you know, because Romulus slays Remus. And just as a bit of a side note, just for history fans, is that it's interesting how various stories or various sort of, you know, mythos drawn from the ancient period often has like an equivalent in other cultures. Like for instance, there's sort of something to be said for Cyrus, or even Moses, and being amongst the reeds, which Romulus and Remus are found by the riverside of the Tiber, you know, and shackled by a sea wolf. Like there's obviously differences, but there's similarities. And likewise, you have in the Bible, you obviously have Cain and Abel. Yeah. And one slains the other, a fratricide. And you also have fratricide here with Romulus and Remus. And
Sargon the Great is a very, very similar story.
Correct, yes.
And one of the Egyptians...
Not Carl, of course, but...
Yeah, not Carl Benjamin, the Sargon. Yes. And there's one
Carl's
of the...
brother is in the Avon somewhere, you know, just...
One of the Egyptian, is it Osiris or somebody? It's basically...
Was it
it's basically
Ramses?
the most...
Was it one of the Ramses?
No, not one of the pharaohs. I think one of their deities. Anyway, the point you're making is that that same story essentially, a small babe abandoned on a river and then doesn't die and grows up to become a king
and saved by a shepherd and sort of right.
So that story has been recycled many times.
The Roman one's unique though, with the inclusion of the she-wolf.
Right, yeah.
And what's interesting is that imagery is so powerful. Like even today, for instance, you know, you look at in Rome, if you look at say you go to the city of Rome and you want to buy like some kind of like trinkets or whatever. The she-wolf and the 2 babes is a prominent thing that the Romans still take pride in. In fact, the Italian soccer club, Serie A, AS Roma, which has been a club since I think 26 or 27, 1926 or 27. Their emblem, their logo is the she-wolf with and it's just such an integral part of Roman, you know, symbolic identity. That survived through the ages. I mean, you got to think 753 BC to 2024. You know, we're separated by what? 27 something 100 years, you know, and it's still vivid for Romans. I was
surprised when I first went to Rome. I was surprised. The 2 things that surprised me, because obviously before I'd gone, I'd seen lots and lots of images, and I even studied the topography of the Forum at uni and stuff. But I didn't go until I was in my early 20s. I've been multiple times now, but first time I went, the thing that surprised me was on the. It actually says SPQR still on
the drain covers.
On drain covers everywhere. I was like, that's a cool touch. And the iconography of the she-wolf is everywhere as well. And also
the laurel wreath as well. Yeah, is common. Yeah.
So it's that was great. I bought a Roma top as well when I was there.
Yeah. I actually have one as well, but that's another.
And I wore it in Florence, and people would literally.
Rookie error, my friend.
Yeah. They didn't find it funny.
No.
It wasn't like ha ha ha. No, they were like. You need to change, dude.
It has enough wearing it in the hometown, because usually there's like rival clubs, but wearing in a rival city is like the worst thing to do in Italy.
Like, it's okay.
Pity we weren't friends. I would have informed you otherwise. You know.
It's okay to wear a Newcastle top in Birmingham. You're not going to get beaten up. It's fine. To wear an Arsenal top anywhere in England, it's fine. Italy, no, not so much.
Someone will literally throw a Vesper at you, you know. But anyway.
Yeah, I had a couple of people come up to me, deadly serious, like no, like that in Florence.
Tutto non bene.
Yeah. I was like. Yeah, I'm going to go back to the hotel and put something else on. These guys seem serious. Anyway. So Numa, a quick thing about them.
It's emblemic, very much symbolic of the rivalry between Italian city-states from the ancient period to now.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've always quarrelled.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry, you're saying.
So what, like some of the other kings, Numa's an important one, right?
So Numa Pompilius is the second king, and he essentially is responsible for the creation of a number of like the early titles. For instance, like the Pontifex Maximus, the High Priest. I believe I can't remember some of the other ranks now, but some like those early sort of senatorial ranks were sort of devised by Numa Pompilius. Tullius Hostilius is the third king. He's responsible for actually the destruction of Alba Longa. Because what's interesting with the Alba Longa is that really Alba Longa's a city of significance in ancient Latium prior to Rome. And in fact, if you take the Aeneas story as the historical path, Aeneas essentially makes it to Rome via Alba Longa.
Right.
His party, sort of, that's their last stop prior to going to Rome, and actually a few of the citizens of Alba Longa join them with the prospect of creating a new city or a new town, as it were, a new settlement.
Is it right that if you head out to Ostia, you'll be passing through what was Alba Longa? Is that right? Is it effectively to the west of Rome?
So
right?
Ostia is to the west of Rome, which takes you to the coast.
Yeah.
Alba Longa is south.
Okay.
Because basically you sort of, as you... I mean, I know it's going pretty...
So I've never visited the ruins of Alba Longa. I've been to Rome multiple times, but never there.
Funnily enough, on a totally separate issue, there's a number of wonderful eateries in the Alban Hills. Because they sort of... A lot of the way that the local diet is very reminiscent of how like ancient Romans would eat. Like, for instance, like it's very like meat and vegetable based, like very hearty sort of food. You know, the kind of thing, if you go to like a country pub in England, a sort of reminiscence of, have like guinea fowl and this, that, and the other, and, pork and, lard, whatever. It's so historical, and that tradition is carried on literally for thousands of years. They sort of eat very much like their ancestors. That aside, if you go to Alba Longa today, it's to the south of Rome because the Alban Hills kind of curl around from like sort of the east of Rome down to the south. It's like a sort of, imagine like a reverse J shape. Because then sort of as you push past the Alban Hills, you sort of end up, towards like the Apennines, the spine of Italy. And really, for a long time, the Alban Hills were sort of that sort of barrier between what the Romans would call their nascent city-state and then sort of the other Italic tribes that were in the hills, which in many ways ended up being the motivation for Rome to sort of be a participant in the Latin League and to sort of create essentially an alliance network to defend the lowlands from the mountain peoples. Ancus Marcius is the one who's the king who's responsible for defeating the Sabines in the famous rape of the Sabines.
Is he the fourth king then?
He's the fourth king, yes.
And so that's a sort of a key story, isn't it? The rape of the Sabines. Basically, the Romans just decided they didn't have
Acquiring
enough
wives.
They didn't have enough women folk. Just as simple as that. So they lured the Sabines over, and then what's the story? They basically arrested the men so that they could just take the women.
And then the Sabine women chastised their own men for not being manly enough to defend them, then actually wanted to go to the Romans because they sort of displayed more, manliness, I suppose.
I did do a bit of content all about, what was it? I did do a bit of content about that and read up a few different versions of the rape of the Sabines, and there was some sort of battle though, wasn't there?
Yes, there was.
In the end, the Sabine men did put up a fight though, in the end, didn't they?
Ultimately, yeah.
Right,
but it was in vain,
Right, yeah. Because
you might say they were shamed into...
Right, yeah, shamed into
a kerfuffle, yeah.
Right. So the Sabine women who become Roman women, really, again, that's like saying they're tough. Roman women are tough, or they're born from a tough stock. So this is still really early on, right? I mean, this is still in the realm of
You're talking like
semi-history, right? It's not firm history, is it?
Well, because this is the thing. So just to move on past Priscus, so you get to Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, who's then the fifth king of Rome, and Priscus is sort of, again, if you're taking this as concrete history, is the person who sort of starts to form Rome as something of a nascent city. Not technically a city as such, but he is the person who constructs the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain, drains the Forum as a result, creates the means by which the Forum can be constructed and built. He also builds the Circus Maximus and invites charioteers from Etruria to actually demonstrate chariot racing to the Romans. And of course, as we know, chariot racing has become synonymous with Rome, all the way to the point that there is then the Hippodrome in Constantinople, almost 1,500 years later, and it's cherished for all of that civilizational history, from Priscus all the way to 1204, with the Fourth Crusade.
So does the archaeology show that there's a few villages at this point, like 5? So there's 7 hills of Rome, right? But there's 5 main ones, or 5 older ones, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so at this point there's
Palatine, Capitoline, Aventine are the sort of main ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Equine. And one I never remember. One I always forget. Anyway, so like 5 villages, settlements around these, and at some point they become... Yeah, that sounds right.
Caelan Hill, yeah.
They become...
they amalgamate into
Rome,
settlement, yeah.
Into Rome.
Yeah.
So this is what around that time that really happened. So I think the archaeology shows there's been settlements there since like 1000 BC, but it wouldn't have been the city of Rome till way after that.
Exactly, yeah.
Like hundreds of years
before
it was a city.
Chances are that, for instance, whether it's Romulus and Remus or Aeneas, stumble upon, there would have already been people there.
Yeah.
It just seems too likely a place, because you consider that between the hills there was marshes, and the confluence of the Tiber and where Rome eventually ends up being located, it just would have been too sort of viable a place to actually not have had population centres, in a sense. Although the marshes would present a risk like for malaria and that sort of thing. The fact that it then would lead to what would become Ostia and the mouth of the Tiber into the Mediterranean, because we sort of know from archaeological evidence that has come out of the historians that have looked into the Etruscans and Etruria, that Etrurian coins have been found in most corners of the Mediterranean, and they have found artifacts where sort of the Etruscans were trading with the Phoenicians, they were trading with the Greeks, and so if you had all these maritime networks, and of course the Etruscans very famously traded with the Gauls, because frankly, once the Gauls were the recipients of Tuscan wine, they thought that Italy would have to be the most wonderful place in the world, because they produced this, elixir, as it were, which they were unaccustomed to, because they, the Gauls and the Germans weren't wine, they weren't vintners, they didn't have vineyards. So we know that the Etruscans were commercially very active and engaged in, basically, you could call it pan-Mediterranean trade. It would seem unlikely then, because the Greeks at that point had already settled much of eastern Sicily, places like Syracuse, Taormina, Messina, Catania, Leontili. These cities were very active. Magna Graeca was arguably a wealthier, more important place than Rome. Well, not arguably, they were. Places like Tarentum, Brindisi, Bari, Crotone, etc. And then Neapolis, modern-day Naples, was one of the probably hallmark cities of the western coast of Italy. So you kind of think you have all this activity in Magna Graecia, you have Etruria. It kind of seems unlikely that the Tiber was insignificant, because it's right between that trade confluence between these two separate peoples. I'm merely surmising, but that's
I think you should. I think right. So basically, what you're saying there, Greater Greece, or the idea that Greek peoples just settled Italy, largely southern Italy and Sicily, well, the whole of the Med, all around Marseille and all over the place, but
and Porre in Spain and other places.
Heavily, the southern half of Italy and Sicily. So when you look at a map of like the fledgling Rome, they're going to show all sorts of things: the Latins, the Sabines, the Etruscans, and most of the southern half will just say like Greeks,
Magna Graecia,
Greek states, Greek states.
Exactly. And true for the island and for the mainland, of course. Yeah.
And even if you think of, if you go with the Aeneas story, I mean, anyway. So, but it's not, like, for example, the rape of the Sabines, or the last kings, or all of the kings, it's only really Livy, right? Or Cassius Dio, but mainly it's Livy.
Mostly Livy.
It's basically Livy, right? There's the proper.
I mean, Polybius does write his Rise of the Roman Republic, but it's more post that period.
I'm thinking, does Polybius? I don't remember ever reading much in Polybius.
I mean, his book is the Rise of the Republic, like it is.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, like, that still has to have a foundation point, It's just I haven't read Polybius in a long time. I really should have done for this discussion, but I can't carry all my books with me, sadly.
So Livy's living in the age of Augustus, basically. So, and he doesn't often mention his sources, who he's reading, because he's talking about stuff that's 700 years before him, 600 years, or 500 years before him. So if he's wrong in any way, if his research isn't perfect, or whoever he is reading, they are not telling the truth, or their research isn't perfect,
it's all embellishment.
then we're on foundations of sand here.
Well, there's two other things to consider as well. Is that firstly, much would have been lost in the sack of 390 after the Alia, and we'll get to Alia, obviously.
Absolutely brilliant point. Yeah, of course.
And the second thing is too is that even subsequent from 390 up to the age of Livy would have had access to materials and sources that probably would have been subsequently lost, say with the various sackings of Rome in 410 and
AD.
exactly AD and 453 and 476. The conquest with the Ostrogoths and the sack of the Vandals, all that. We simply have no idea with how much was lost. And indeed, like not to go on a tangent, but if copies of those then resided in Constantinople, they were lost in 1204. So we really don't know.
It's remarkable we've got anything by someone like Livy.
Yeah.
It's remarkable that you can go out and buy a Penguin paperback of Livy. It's incredible that anything survived.
Well, I was going to say, in terms of like this period of time, and obviously Livy does go back a bit further than Polybius, but if we did not have Livy and Polybius, the study of the Roman Republic and even slightly pre-Republic would be essentially impossible.
Yeah. This Cassius Dio.
And also to some degree too, we have Diodorus Siculus, Diodorus of Sicily, as a Greek writer writing about as an external Greek man looking in. He covers this period of history somewhat, but it's a bit more scattered. It's like Livy's like literally sort of an encyclopedic sort of A to Z.
Very scattered. Awfully scattered.
Just scattered, yeah. A nation, not a village, but anyway.
So Livy, the problem is, I don't want to keep going over it, but if Livy is wrong in any way, basically, then we're just dealing with
myth,
right?
More or less, yeah.
Because the idea that the kings ruled for over 200 years and only 7 of them, so each one has got a really, really long reign. Just there's loads of things about the kings of Rome where you're like, doesn't feel like proper history. It feels like fable.
Yeah, and it does. I mean, you got to think too, like even decide between Romulus and Remus and Aeneas feels like you're dealing with the realm of myth,
Yeah. But they were elected kings, right, until the last one?
Well, from to my knowledge, from Priscus onwards, it sort of then becomes a bit of a dynasty because you have Servius Tullius, who ends up building the Servian walls that sort of were the original walls of Rome, and they were not superseded until the time of Aurelian, who then constructs the Aurelian walls during the crisis of the 3rd century. And they're the walls that you
700 years later?
Exactly.
Like hundreds,
because the Romans just felt no necessity for it. Once sort of the Republic expanded beyond Italy and sort of incorporated North Africa and parts of Spain, eventually with Caesar's conquest of Gaul, the Romans were like, who's going to attack us? I mean, rightly so. Yeah. But obviously with the crisis of the 3rd century and the incursions like through Raetia and through Noricum into Italy, barbarians passing through the Alpine passes, Aurelian obviously was motivated to build walls. And there, if you travel to Rome today, I mean, you sort of make it out the old city. Those walls that are in Rome today are the Aurelian walls. The Servian walls exist in fragments and have been built upon, but as an actual contiguous visual structure, the Servian walls have long been sort of absorbed by the greater city.
That's why Hannibal was such a worry in 216 odd BC, 215, 16, 17, I can't remember exactly. But then, BC, that's why it's such a worry, because they didn't have like some sort of Byzantines, like the walls of Theodosius, for example. They didn't have this incredible thing to defend themselves.
Or even the Aurelian walls themselves, which were something of a force multiplier,
Yeah. So, but you mentioned also 390, that's Brennus, right?
Yeah.
We're jumping ahead a bit, but so Rome was sacked at one point in its early period.
All but its capital, yeah.
Sorry?
All but its capital. Should we talk about the expulsion of the kings just briefly?
Yes. Yeah, no, please do. Yeah, okay. I jumped ahead a bit there.
No, that's okay.
Unnecessarily.
No, that's all right. So, like, if we're sort of talking about the early apocryphal foundation of Rome, so Sextus Tarquinius is the son of the last king, Lucius Tarquinius of Epirus. And what's interesting about that is that if you actually study or speak Italian today, the Italians have a very particular word to describe a particular type of haughtiness or arrogance, and we call it superbia.
Right.
And it survived in our lexicon as a result of the conduct of the House of Tarquinius.
Right.
So Tarquinius,
because sometimes it's called Tarquin the Proud, right?
Yeah.
Is that
essentially?
Is that one of the closest translation words you use? Being proud.
Yeah. So
and pride being a sin, like it's not good.
Yeah,
not in a good way.
Let's call it like negative pride. Yeah,
Right.
Because I suppose it's like proud in like, you know, I get my suits clean. I'm proud of my appearance. It's
not
like
that.
there's a good pride, but then there's, you know, the
bad pride.
arrogant, tyrannical, so haughty pride. So the Tarquinius of Epirus was sort of renowned for being tyrannical. Was renowned for, you know, like fleecing the aristocracy and, you know, bleeding the people of Rome dry, and for, you know, using force as an oppressive means against this nascent city, and sort
usurped the last king, right? And his wife ran him over, or her own father, right?
Yeah,
you know that story?
Well, Servius Tullius, yeah.
They run him over in a chariot and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
So he's almost like a two-dimensional baddie, right?
Yeah,
he's a proper...
He's a Marvel villain.
Yeah, he's a Marvel villain, right? Yeah.
Like, I'm actually kind of surprised like they haven't created like a Tarquinius of Epirus kind of character in that. But anyway, it's not the all there.
Yeah.
So in sort of this occurs in like sort of 508-9. The second son of Tarquinius of Epirus, Sextus, rapes one of the daughters of one of the leading aristocrats of the city, Lucretia, which is interesting because if you sort of fast forward in Italian history, you have the Borgias, and who's the sister? Also Lucretia. Like, it's like funny how, you know, history never repeats itself, but it often rhymes. She was the daughter of a Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, who was a cousin of the king and obviously Lucretia's husband. And this sort of coalition of Roman aristocrats, very famously led by Lucius Junius Brutus, who's sort of the what would you call him? The patriarch of the Brutii, who becomes like
the original Brutus, right?
I mean, he obviously would have been the son of other Brutii, but he's the prominent
original
paragon,
famous Brutus.
The famous Brutus, who was the king's nephew, and Spurius Lucretius. And who's Lucretia's father, and another nobleman by the name of Publius Valerius Popicola, end up sort of fomenting this rebellion against Sextus and his father Tarquinius of Epirus, and they drive them out of the city. Sextus is in the city, from if you believe the mythology, and Tarquinius of Epirus is actually campaigning amongst the Latin League south of Rome, and he leads this army which had been raised in the sort of the Roman hinterland, or what was the hinterland of the city-state. And he actually marches on Rome to try and recapture the city, but the senators convince the army to turn against the king. So essentially his army defects to the city, and Tarquinius of Epirus is forced to march back to Etruria with his tail between his legs with his son, who caused this mess. And that is sort of like essentially is the foundation story of the expulsion of the kings, the creation of the republic, the creation of the republican institutions. Also, as well, etching in the Roman psychology their hatred for Rex, the hatred and their utter dismay towards the idea of a king.
There are a few things there, because there's been the rape of the Sabines, the rape of Lucretia. There is the fratricide of Romulus and Remus. Even the battle between Aeneas and Turnus. In their foundations, in their DNA, is violence and crime.
A turbulent spirit,
right?
Shall we say,
let's call it turbulent. That's a nice way of saying it. But it's not. It's the ancient world, right? It's always a bit turbulent. But it's not something they're ashamed of or anything. It's like, no, we're a violent war type people. You mess with us, see what happens. This is who we are. Right? They're not ashamed of it in any way.
In fact, they keep writing it down and recording it.
They're happy with it. Happy about it. I suppose it is a bit like gangsters. A big part of it, or even being a professional boxer or MMA fighter, a big part of it is that you need to be known to be a badass. Yeah. That's a big part of it. Yeah. The whole world needs to know how bad you are. Yeah. Right? Very deliberately. Yeah. Like Assyrian kings, maybe. Yeah. The idea that your reputation precedes you, Yeah, be afraid. Yeah. It's in your interest to be afraid of me. Right. Yeah.
And when I was here, hang on, was it with you, or I'm trying to think. It wouldn't be with you because it's Byzantium we talked about last time. But I mentioned I just cannot. Oh no, I remember now. It was my stream I did with Oron. And I mentioned Anthony Hopkins, who was a professor of Cambridge, who's now since...
Oh, not the actor?
No. Okay. No, hang on. Professor I can't remember his first name, but Professor Hopkins from Cambridge University, who's now since deceased, right?
Okay.
No, not Anthony Hopkins, sorry. But Professor Hopkins from Cambridge University, who's long since deceased, maybe like 15 or so years ago. But he was sort of like a leading historian regarding the sort of Republican period, and like leading to the sort of the triumvirate, first and second triumvirate period. And he sort of made the point that, I sort of remember this in a documentary he did for BBC back in like the late 90s. He sort of said that really there's something so obvious about the Romans, or at least it sort of is a tendency that crops up again and again. They are more fierce than their neighbours, they are more sort of determined than their neighbours, they are more, willing to go above and beyond than their neighbours. They just are essentially, in the sort of contest of nations and peoples, hungrier and more violent than their neighbours.
Aggressive,
and
ambitious.
And the point I was going to make at like the very beginning here was that, like, Italy, and sort of the way that Rome is framed, particularly say in mass media, and the way we sort of like envision this empire, and like, Rome marches 10 legions to this province and like quash these people, and it's the whole oppressor versus oppressed thing. But like, Rome wasn't always a great empire. In fact, Rome's origins are very, very humble and very, very sort of shrouded in mythos, and the initial Roman state was very, very small and almost insignificant. Like, Antigonos or Seleucus would have laughed at the early republic. When you sort of think like the Battle of Ipsus that was fought between, Ipsus, that was fought in Phrygia between Demetrius and Antigonos, and the coalition of the other successors was like 70,000 men aside. At that point, Rome was like barely able to field 10,000 men to like, fight the Latin League. We're talking matters of proportion different, and that sort of struggle for hegemony and struggle for domination of Italy was a grueling process. It was, like generations and generations of men, fought, and the Romans fought. They fought the Sabines, they fought the Latin League, they fought the Volsci, they fought 3 wars against the Samnites. We'll get to that. Yeah. And in the end, that's just for dominion over central Italy. Right. They haven't even fought the Greeks yet. They haven't really, aside from the capture of Veii, they haven't really even fought the Etruscans. It's and there's this whole body of old Roman history that is hardly touched. And even then, Italy itself is not uniform. I mean, we'll obviously get to the Samnites soon, but like, you have the Romans who are Latin Italic people, because you have several sort of Italic people. The Umbrians are a northern Italic people from a slightly separate group. And then sort of in the south, you have the Samnites, and the Lucanians are kind of a bit half-half, but you have these Oscan-speaking Sabellian people who are cousins of the Romans and the Latins, but are not necessarily Latins. Yeah. They are a different subgroup with a different language. You look at like the artifacts that they've dug out of central southern Italy that isn't Greek, and Sabellian is it's a cousin language to Latin, but it's not Latin. Right. And people just, if they've never read about this, they just don't know.
No, Rome absolutely started from scratch. Essentially, it seems like it literally started from scratch.
Maybe 3 houses and a palisade, like that was it.
Yeah. And so, it's a great point you make, but this is what forged them. I mean, literally hundreds of years before they dominate Tuscany, which in modern terms is sort of next door. It's sort of...
And like a province of Italy.
So it took and it's sort of forged their character, their sort of national character, if that's the right type of word, the character of their city-state. It's a remarkable story. So, even somebody like... the much more ancient empires of like Babylon or Assyria or Egypt or something, Rome would have been... You would never dream in a million years that this little central Italian
insignificant little hilltop village
could ever dream of rivaling them. It's ridiculous, right?
Like imagine being in Nebuchadnezzar or Tiglath-Pileser, arriving in Rome and just going, give me 20 soldiers, I'll capture this place,
Yeah. It's like some random little tiny hamlet in modern day Armenia might end up dominating China or the United States at some point. It's just, you wouldn't put money on it. You would never put money on that.
The empire of Ani, for instance, or the empire of Yerevan, and it's like all of Anatolia, all the Near East, half of Iran, Egypt. But it's not that, it's Rome.
Yeah. Yeah. So, when Brutus decides that he's had enough, or all the Romans really. It seems like
that aristocratic elite that kick out the Etruscans. Yeah,
it seems like it was fairly unanimous that they'd had enough of both Superbus and Sextus, but also just monarchy. So they start with consuls, the dual consul thing immediately, right? They jump straight into that. There's not a period of, well, we need to figure out how we're going to do this. And
so the two men who basically lead the revolt, which is it's Lucius Brutus and Collatinus, are the first two consuls,
right?
Which is what sort of ends up, to some degree, potentially offering some concrete evidence to the fact that, if not the events as are discussed, the rape of Lucrezia and this sort of thing, some of it might be apocryphal, but the idea that we have two consuls straight away, and it's the two men who lead the revolution against revolution is the wrong word, but this revolt against the Etruscans and the expulsion of the kings, something being to that. Because obviously this system just doesn't materialize out of the ether. There must be a series of events that precede up to it. And a bit like even with the king, for instance, it's not like the Romans just sort of just woke up one day and just, they have to go. It's a bit like, the lead up to like 1776, or the lead up to like, Caesar crossing the Rubicon. It's not just that event in isolation. There's a series of things that lead, in the case of, say, Caesar, it's like it's the brothers Gracchi, it's Sulla, it's the social war, and then things lead to a climactic period and an apex of events. And it's like the same thing. It would have been the rule of certainly a few of those kings, plus Superbus being according to the stories you read, particularly tyrannical, particularly domineering, particularly corrupt, and then his son does his business, his thing, and it's just like the one act that turns people against it. But it's like, had the rape just occurred on its own, it probably would have been a major event, but just an event. But it's that thing on top of a pile of other circumstances that creates this environment that just, the whole notion of a straw breaking camel's back. It's not just the one thing, it's the whole pile of straw that's there. And then the Romans are just incensed by this one act. That's like one act too many. And Roman history is transformed forever. Rather than just being this sort of client little, rump entity that's sort of attached to Etruria, Rome establishes its own city-state.
What I find interesting is that and obviously there's a lot more to it than we actually get in Livy, but that they decide to go with a republic at all, because there's no guarantee that, if we do away with the monarchy, then, we're definitely going to have a republic. Not necessarily. There's all sorts of different things you could have. And then they go with this odd, I think kind of odd, dual consul idea. Again, there's nothing written in the stars that should be the way it has to be or anything.
Well, we got to think, to the east, we have the Athenian experiment with democracy.
I was going to talk about...
sorry.
No, go ahead. No, I was just going to talk about the tyrants and the archons and... and Alcibiades or whatever. And, you go ahead.
Just to say that obviously to the east they have this Greek experiment with democracy that's sort of led by Athens and sort of spread by the Delian League, as it were. Sort of the original GAE, as it were. We are spreading democracy, by the bow tip of the Athenian navy, so to speak. And yet, for all of the ideas that have stemmed from Solon and Pericles and the great Athenian thinkers of the time, and certainly those that created those bodies of Athenian law that sort of came to become the ideas that Athens then spreads out to the Hellenic world, is that Rome obviously, I would presume to a point, would have been a recipient via osmosis of some of these concepts, but they don't create an assembly insofar of like a people citizens assembly. The tribunes to some degree are that, but the creation of a senate and the creation and the idea of like two rotating consuls that are elected every year by the aristocratic senatorial class is a system without precedent. The Romans conceive of it themselves. There might be ideas that are derived from Athens, say, or from here or there. For example, the Romans did have contact with the Gauls, and the Gauls in some parts had elected chieftains. Like for instance, Vercingetorix becomes chieftain because him and his brother, the Averni can't decide who, so they have a trial by what do they call it, trial by pain, and eventually Vercingetorix wins. Right. He overcomes his brother, but like the Romans would have had some smattering of ideas, and the Etruscans too, I believe, to an extent, had something resembling elective monarchy in some of their cities, but the Romans would have had access to some of these ideas, and yet sort of take bits and pieces. As the Romans actually prove going forward, they have this propensity of, oh, this is good, oh, the gladius is good, the galea is good, we're just going to incorporate these things because they work. A hugely pragmatic people. The Romans prove this over again. And you could say it also applies to the creation of their system of government and their institutions,
Because you mentioned a few things there. So most of those 7 kings were Etruscan or perhaps Etruscan adjacent type people. So they're also sort of doing away with being ruled by Etruscans, and the idea of having a democracy, because the Senate that already existed, like 100-man Senate, right? So not exactly,
which was then doubled, I believe, either by
doubled.
I think it was doubled by either Servius Tullius or Priscus. I can't remember, but
but they certainly had a body
that pre-existed the Republic.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not like they do away with Superbus, exile Superbus, and then come up with the idea of a Senate. No, they already existed. But then this system of having consuls, and then you talk about tribunes and all that sort of thing. So they are creating that, though. Maybe not entirely from whole cloth.
The limbs are attached to the body, as it were, the torso of the Senate.
Right. But they put it together in such a way that, well, it obviously serves them well. Maybe it's one of those things where you look back at history, and because something did really well, like the British Empire, or like the United States, because it did really well, the tendency is to look back at it and said, well, they did something brilliant in the first instance, which meant that they were always going to be very, very successful. That's not. I think that's often a misleading way to look at history. Sometimes it will be true, sometimes it won't be, right?
But it's often presumptuous to take that line of thinking.
Yeah. But whatever you can say about Rome is that over the next, well, with 1 or 2 hiccups, over the next few centuries, they do live out this just incredible narrative.
A meteoric rise, one might say.
Meteoric, right? Exactly. Yeah. So it is incredible. No wonder people are still talking about it to this day.
Yeah. I mean, think about it too. I mentioned a few names, but like the Etruscans. At the point in which the Republic is founded and the kings are expelled, the Etruscans are more powerful. The Samnites nominally more powerful. Yeah. The Lucanians are more powerful. Yeah. The Umbrians probably on paper are more powerful. Rome is surrounded by peoples that are more powerful than them.
The unknown and unnumbered Gauls somewhere to the north.
Yeah. And that's just this side of the Alps.
Right,
Never mind the other side of the Alps.
Right,
the distinction between Cis and Transalpine Gaul, of course.
Yeah.
But yet, who comes to prevail in that entire struggle is the Romans.
Right.
Which, to go back to like what Professor Hopkins said, like in that BBC documentary, the Romans just were more vicious and more ferocious and more determined, and it proved itself.
So where would you go to? Where would you take the narrative after sort of the age of Brutus? Then who are the first people that they start knocking off?
Well, I was going to say we touch on the Latin League, and the Latin League is an interesting example where the Romans allied with the Latin League in 493 in a treaty called the Foedus Cassianum. That's the name of the treaty, and we know this because Livy actually references it specifically. But funnily enough, it's actually imposed by the Romans on the Latin League after they defeat them at the Battle of Lake Regillus, which is just sort of maybe like a 20-mile march south of Rome. And because the Latin tribes between, you might say, the Alban Hills, the Apennines, and the coast, the Tyrrhenian coast, they're prone to be vulnerable to attack by the Aequi, the Volsci, these other tribes sort of sit in that foothills area. And so the Romans go, all right, we've crushed you now, but we're all Latin-speaking sort of Italic peoples. Let's just bound together now. And that is essentially almost the genesis of you might call like the sort of Confederate Roman Allied system, is the absorption of the Allied League into the Roman Republican sphere. And the founding cities of the League were cities such as Ardea, which will become important afterwards when we get to Camillus Furius, Arica, Cara, Lavinium, Lavianum, Pomentia, Tibur, and Tusculum.
Right.
These are like these clusters of cities, and some of them actually still exist today. Some of them are still are nothing but ruins, and they sort of they create like this nexus, this genesis of what becomes Roman Latin power and the consolidation of the Latin-speaking Italic peoples in Latium. And sort of the Italians call it Lazio today, but Lazio Latium, it's the same thing. This is where those you might call it the origins of the Latins begin as a unified people in central Italy.
Well, even today, there's still a football club, Lazio, right? I mean,
yeah, that's right. Yeah. well, Roma, AS Roma being the city club, and Lazio being like the hinterland club.
Right,
It's kind of poetic that distinction exists.
Yeah. One of the other things, very quick aside, we was talking about the real life modern Rome. There's lots and lots of graffiti in Rome.
Much
and you know when you're in a Lazio quarter, you know, it's like, okay, the Lazio guys around here.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so, I mean, it is quite slow though, isn't it? The first expansion. I suppose like a lot of these things, I suppose it is always going to be the nature of it, or maybe it's hard baked into it that the bigger you become, the faster and more aggressive your expansion could be. So the other end of that spectrum is when you're small, when you're still a small friar, it's slow and you've got to really battle tooth and nail for every little inch, right?
Every hilltop, every suburb, every river.
So it's not like they just keep conquering their neighbours year after year after year, and within 50 years they've done all of Italy.
Yeah.
It's not like that at all, is it? It's a long, drawn out, painful process.
Very painstaking and very sort of almost like, it's the kind of thing too that sort of embeds what, if we could call it, Roman psychology. That sort of, particularly if you look at the way the legions fight, all the way from even the pre-Manipula period all the way up to probably the time of even Aurelian or even Constantine, is that there's this way in which the Romans, sort of in a martial sense, you know, they're gritty and disciplined and determined, and they don't like yielding. And even, like, for instance, when the Romans suffer a catastrophic defeat, right, such as, you know, for instance, I mean, courting Forks wasn't a massacre, but like it was a shameful period for the Romans, right? They were humiliated by the Samnites.
So which period?
Courting Forks in the Samnite Wars.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, Cannae is a very typical example of the Romans just being totally shellacked on A, home turf, and B, on a topography that would suit how the legions fight. You know, Trasimene, a lot of people make a big deal about Cannae, rightly so, but arguably, like, Trasimene is an even bigger disaster. There's less survivors, an entire army's massacred. But like every time the Romans are defeated, like most countries will suffer a war weariness, so they want to give up or they want to sign armistice, but the Romans just dig deeper and deeper and deeper. And it actually just, like, when we touch on Aeneas and the quote in the Samnite Wars, but it's like the Romans just they sort of like win via hatred and spite. That, like, the more you humiliate them, the greater the desire to want to conquer you. Like, and the Romans display this spirit like really early on in their history. You know, it goes back to, I suppose we're moving on from the Latin League here, where the next thing we should probably touch on is the second founder of Rome, Marcus Camillus Pyrrhus, partially my namesake on X and Twitter. Because he's just such a fabulous character. He's actually just, I find him one of the most remarkable men of antiquity, actually. And then secondly, you know, like this interaction with Brennus and the Gauls, and like, again, most other nations or cities would have just folded, but the Romans don't. You know, it's a very interesting.
That is in their nature to be very, very tenacious and never ever give. You mentioned Lake Trasimene there. That's one of my favourite battles of all time. It's not that big.
It's genius though.
But I love all the details of it. Absolutely love it.
It's a flawless plan.
But but the point, the overall point you were making there, that they're tenacious and never give in. Two things sprung to mind. One was, after Cannae, and one after one of the big, I think maybe the first big battle that Pyrrhus of Epirus wins against them.
Heraclea.
Is it Heraclea? Yeah. And he says, right, let's talk Turkey. Let's do a prisoner swap. Let's start talking about stuff. And the Romans are just like, no, you can keep all the captives you've got because we're not dealing with you while you're on Italian soil.
And this treaty?
Yeah.
You can take it back with you.
No, thank you. No, thank you. Thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah.
And like, so everyone, the rest of the world, like,
just
are you mad?
Are you mad? Pyrrhus is like, what? You know?
Yeah.
Who are these people? You know?
Yeah, you're out of your mind. Yeah. And they're like, yeah, we think what you want, but we've got our line in the sand here, and nothing will get us to budge from it. No. So, getting ahead of ourselves.
We'll get to Pyrrhus
cherry picking bits and bobs, aren't we? But to go through then, so after sort of the Latin League, after the immediate environs around Rome, we're talking radiuses of like
probably
not even,
25 miles,
yeah,
30 miles.
I was going to say not even 50 miles.
What you would
right?
probably
So,
call the Tiber Basin, essentially.
but out
you
to
know.
Ostia, what becomes Ostia, so out to the sea, but beyond that, not beyond the Apennines,
No.
not very far north or south, really.
More south than north, but
right.
yeah.
So still a long way to go before you've even got, again, what we would call central Italy, like nowhere like modern Tuscany.
This is a rump of a part of Lazio, more or less.
Right.
And because I mentioned Marcus Furius Camillus, right? This is the thing. The Romans really take their first cities north of the Tiber. The Romans, the attack on Veii ends up being a 10-year siege.
Right.
Like a whole generation of men, join the army, retire. The next generation are inducted, and they're still besieging Veii, right?
It's remarkable how often that is. Like the siege of Troy is supposed to be 10 years, and you think Homer's making that. That's ridiculous. As if that would ever happen. It's like no, that's not uncommon.
Look what the Romans are doing,
Yeah. Or I think Nebuchadnezzar didn't he do a siege of Tyre or something? It was like 20 years, something stupid. It's like So that totally did happen loads. But anyway,
or at least to an extent,
or maybe not loads. But it wasn't unheard of.
No.
Right. It's not like a unique thing.
And if you want to be like super technical as well, sorry to tangent, I apologise.
No.
But like for instance, the yearly campaigns of the Spartans to the walls of Attica to Athens and just burning the crops and like marching away. Like technically, Athens was like besieged for half of the Peloponnesian War.
Right.
I mean, not a constant blockade or anything, but the Spartans march in, burn the crops, march away. Throw a few stones on the walls, march back out. Because the things essentially couldn't use their hinterland. So they had to bring in grain from via their navy, and Athens stood right till the end of the war. In that sense. And these kind of prolonged campaigns and sieges. I mean, listen, there might be aspects, for example, well, Troy being literally semi-mythological, but even like the siege of Veii, is it embellished? Quite possibly. But I mean, in the end, we sort of know that there's an extensive campaign, and eventually, in the case of Veii, we know Veii is captured. And we know this because, there's a narrative behind it whereby Furius Camillus is appointed dictator by the Romans. He has a 6-month term. So, he takes over the siege. He devises a plan in which to capture it. And how he actually does it is that he actually attacks the allies of Veii. He takes these cities to the northeast of Veii called Capensa and Faleri. And eventually he then turns his forces back to Veii and in fact subverts the city by, I think, either the aqueduct or the sewer. It makes his way into the city and then sort of takes it from the inside out, which actually has precedent. There's actually, I think, I can't remember if it's Joshua who captures Jerusalem in the Bible, used a similar mechanism. It actually happens a few times. Belisarius does the same thing when he captures Naples in the Ostrogothic War.
Right, yeah.
So it's a bit of a tried and true method.
Oh, yeah.
Furius Camillus being the first person, well, it depends where, actually, maybe Joshua was first, but I can't remember. Anyway, it's one of the first instances of that actually happening and being described in detail. But he captures Veii, and this brings about controversy because he doesn't allow the soldiers to sack the city, and what treasures they do take, he sends them to Rome as offerings for the gods. But there's not much in the way of excess money for for bribes for the aristocracy, and no great sort of embellishment of people's pockets. He sort of, even his own spoils, he surrenders them to the soldiers because he doesn't want to totally despoil Veii, and he also spared the allied cities. So essentially, Capensa and Faleri come into the Roman sphere without a fight.
Is this still pre-Brennus we're talking?
This is an immediate lead up to Brennus, right?
Okay, right.
So, but because of this controversy that brews up in Rome, and the Romans don't throw Camillus off the Tarpeian Rock because he has immense popular support. Certainly amongst the lower class of citizenry, and he's popular with a strong segment of the army who actually realise okay, this guy helped us take this damn city. I'm still not camped out of Veii because of him. I'm not going to turn my back on him.
Right.
But the aristocracy and certain leading elements of Rome and sort of certain upper class elements of Rome hated him for not. It's we just sacked 3 cities. Where's the gold?
Yeah.
So he ends up being exiled to Ardea, which is, if you remember earlier in the conversation, we talked about was a founding city of the Latin League. So by this point, Ardea is a very sort of integrated part of the Republic and very much sort of Roman by this point, because you're talking 200 years have passed from the integration to now. So Marcus Furius Camillus is sort of, cozying up in a villa somewhere in Ardea, sort of entertaining himself. At this point, the Senones, who And we could probably touch on this a little bit if you wanted to, but basically Italy north of sort of what is modern day like northern Lazio and above was Etruscan dominated, even up to like the Alps. Less so as you go past the Po Valley, but there was Etruscan influences in the north.
Well, Etruscan culture.
Etruscan culture, right? There was a bleed into the north in some settlements.
Yeah.
But because originally like Celtic Gallic culture sort of starts with, they sort of, to use the word, Hallstatt culture, which is sort of if you look at a Roman map, like the provinces of, say, Raetia, which is sort of coincides with like southern Germany and Switzerland. But the Gauls overpopulated, they end up sort of moving westwards, populating what is modern day France, or modern, Gaul as we understand it. But a legendary king by the name of Bellovesus ends up leading a contingent of Gauls across the Alps. They being the Senones, the Carnutes, the Bitruges, the Ambari, and elements of the Averni and the Aedui, cross with him across the Alps into northern Italy. They actually totally pushed the Etruscans out of the, what you'd consider, the Italians call it Piedmonte, which means like the foothills, out of Piedmonte, what we call modern day Lombardy, basically throw the Etruscans back across the Po River and establish what we understand to be Cisalpine Gaul, Gaul this side of the Alps. He brings them across, and there's now this sort of settlement of Gauls north of the Alps. The Senones actually break away and march down the east coast, what is sort of modern day Marche in Italy, and that's where the Senones are based. But as the Gauls always are, these sort of like adventurous, warlike, ransacker types, they sort of detect a bit of weakness amongst the Etruscans and even amongst the central Italians and the Umbrians, and they attack a place called Clusium, which is sort of like this Umbrian Etruscan city in the spine of Italy, like where the Apennines, we sort of cross from east to west. And they attack Clusium, and Clusium sends envoys, pardon me, to Rome. And 3 Roman ambassadors make their way to Clusium to try and bargain peace. However, one of the Roman ambassadors ends up being very pro-Clusium and ends up joining the fight. And it is said, again, there's pro parts of this a bit apocryphal, right, that he in fact kills one of the Senone chieftains. So the Senone is completely disengaged from Clusium. Brennus brings about his like war council together. It's like, what do we do? It's like, well, the Romans have violated rules of diplomacy. Apparently the Romans have just exiled their leader, being Marcus Furius Camillus, will march on Rome. And so Brennus and his contingent of Senones, and I believe there were other, it might have been the Boii or the Insubres, they had some allied tribes, but the Senones were the greater part of this army, marched down the middle of the Apennines to the sort of the origin point of the Tiber River, and then sort of down following the river towards Rome. And about a sort of like a 8-10 day march, thereabouts, about 200 kilometers from Clusium to Rome. And the Romans are completely caught off guard. They have about literally like less than 2 weeks to respond. They call their forces in from like the Latin League. They call their forces in from Veii, because obviously they've garrisoned these new cities. Yeah. And they put up an army against Brennus, but Brennus absolutely eats them for breakfast. At this point in time, like, this isn't even the Roman army that's Manipula. This is still a Roman army that fights in the matter of like you might even call like a degenerate phalanx. Like without the qualities of the Hellenic original phalanx. It's not as disciplined, it's not as, stern, it's probably not as well armoured.
It's funny, I'm sure everyone out there has got this image of the Roman legionary.
The Imperial Legionnaire,
Yeah, the Imperial Legions, all in sort of uniform, armour, with the Galea,
the Lorica Segmentata, the Gladius, the Scutum,
the shield with the thunderbolts on it every time.
And the javelins, the Pila, all that sort of stuff.
So that was absolutely not what we're dealing with here. I mean, that was a moment in time. Even most of Roman history, it wouldn't have been that. No. The vast majority of Roman history wasn't that. So right now, nowhere near that. Right now, you're talking still just like farmer dudes with
and citizen hoplites,
with whatever weapon they've got.
Well, they would have. Right? I mean, they did fight in the manner of a hoplites, so they would have probably had like a round shield and spears.
Right.
But again, they've just fought a 10-year siege at Veii. They probably discharged their veterans. They've just exiled their leading general. What do you think the state of the army's in? So
Brennus does. I mean, well, so I've heard it said, and I suppose I agree, that Brennus is, for going forward, for the rest of Rome's history, Brennus is a boogeyman. He's like this. The worst case scenario is that someone pulls a Brennus on you, right? Whatever we do, whatever happens going forward, we need to make sure no one can repeat what Brennus did to us. It's like an early trauma, like a childhood trauma. Like, I'm not going to let that happen to me ever again, sort of a thing. You know, we've tasted defeat, a real defeat. We know what it means to be an inch away from being absolutely snuffed out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, took the term right out of my mouth, like a mere hair away from being completely obliterated, you know, from just being erased from the pages of history. So the Romans, in their sort of wisdom, because, I mean, in the end, when you have an army that is composed or comprised of certain elements and in a certain way, and you sort of have to determine, okay, these are the less garbage troops and these are the most inexperienced troops. Because the way sort of Arlia is located upriver, up the Tiber from Rome, northeast of the city. No one really knows, but sort of my guess would be like, say, 20, 30 mile from like what would have been the Capitoline or the Palatine Hill.
Yeah.
And the Romans array sort of their forces in roughly sort of like a left and a right flank and a centre. And they weaken the centre to strengthen the flanks, because they put their most inexperienced troops on the right flank, which is actually on the hilltop of where Arlia exists. And they sort of figure if they can, you know, hold the line, be defensive, even if they're inexperienced, they've got, you know, terrain on their side, you know, they can hold, you know. And then we have the middle line, and then we're going to put another larger contingent along the riverside because, you know, there's flat ground, and if Brennus puts his best troops there, we need a larger numerical advantage against the river, because we don't want our flank turned, you know, from really either side. But Brennus puts his best troops against the most inexperienced Roman troops that are on the hilltop. And then, of course, the Romans have weakened their centre so much that so you have the Senones on the Gallic left, you have the Insubres in the middle, and the Boii on the right. And the Boii sort of tie up the Roman left along the river, sort of fairly reliably, but they don't really defeat the Romans as such. But the Insubres and the Senones just demolish the Romans in the centre on the right, completely turning the Roman army. So the part of the army that's closest to the river, they end up crossing the river. They lose casualties in the river crossing, but they basically made their way to Veii, because like the Romans had literally just finished repairing the fortifications of Veii. So it was like a place that they could fortify themselves. And then the youngest troops, the inexperienced troops, and what was left of the centre, literally just run back to Rome. They flee to Rome. And the Romans have probably lost half of, because like some of the early sources, like, oh, it's like 260,000 man armies. It's like neither Rome nor the Senones had the capacity for armies that size.
That's an exaggeration.
We're talking somewhere like maybe 12 to 15,000, like both sides. The Senones might have had 20.
Affair, though.
Not a small affair.
I mean, that's decent, but yeah, when they talk about 60,000, it's just not. It's not. Right, but still, I mean,
you're not talking Antigonus and Demetrius, you know, with the power of Phrygia and Anatolia behind it. You know, it's Rome being a little city-state. You know.
But still, I mean, even 10, 15,000 aside, that's
not insignificant, as you say.
To actually see that with your own eyes, 15,000 aside fellas going at each other, that's going to be quite a melee.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so the city is thrown into absolute chaos with the news of the defeat. Because obviously at this point, like, even the Romans sort of how should I put this? Being somewhat less civilized than the Greeks, but obviously seeing themselves above the Gauls, in a sense, utterly distraught that half their army's been massacred in an afternoon.
There's nothing between them now and Brennus's army.
Yeah, this roaming, marauding, massive Senones and Insubres and Boii. Yeah, exactly. Nothing stands between it and Rome.
Right.
And so the Romans, basically, what exists of the city garrison and the survivors from the battle, fortify the Capitoline Hill, which is like the last central bastion. You know, that's where the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus exists. It's where like the original senatorial house was. It's where the Vestal Virgins and their temple exists. So it's like it's the most sacred precinct of Rome, and the temple of Juno, which actually becomes important quite soon.
So you say the Capitoline?
Yeah.
Is that the one, just incidentally, that today is the Michelangelo one where there's the two museums and the single Marcus Aurelius statue today with the steps going up to it? That's the Capitoline today.
Hill,
Right, okay.
And so Brennus and his war band march on Rome, and the Romans have banded the entirety of the low-lying city and all the other hills except the Capitoline, and they proceed to sort of ravage their way and burn it. What's actually interesting, though, is there's a district, and I believe it might be near the Palatine, where a number of the aristocratic families actually had like their villas and their homes and their sort of mansions, and a number of the old people who just didn't have it in them to withstand a siege just sit outside their homes on their sort of chairs. And the Gauls are
It's a great image, that,
perplexed,
isn't it?
yeah, like
just
these old
stoically,
senators,
just accepting
their fate,
Yeah.
and sort of brushing their old white beards, just waiting. And the Gauls are perplexed, thinking like, why haven't they gone up, And then a kerfuffle breaks out. One Gaul stabs a Roman, and there's a bloodbath, and they've all killed, within a few minutes. But the Romans sort of hold up in the Capitoline. At this point in time, news comes to Ardea to the exiled Marcus Furius Camillus that this catastrophic battle's taken place. Half the Roman army's been massacred. There's a few hold-up survivors in Veii, and the Romans are otherwise holed up in the Capitoline, and the rest of Rome has been put to the torch, more or less. And so, according to what we know, because Brennus basically had no preparation for a siege. He didn't even take, he had no baggage train, no nothing. So he's sending out foraging parties. One of them passes by Ardea, and utilizing, shall I say, like his gravitas and his auctoritas, Marcus Camillus Furius rallies the city garrison and like the few veterans that have been billeted to the city, the colonna, the Roman policy of colonization, rallies the veterans and whatever few young men there are around, craftsmen and shepherds, whoever wants to put on a suit of armor, rallies the local people to just attack and drive off. They end up massacring the foraging party. And then after news of this spreads to the rest of the Republic, certainly to the survivors of Veii, they want him to be like, take command of us. He's like, no. You send a messenger to the city and you have them appoint me dictator.
Right.
Because then that overrides his exile.
Right, okay, got it. Right, yeah.
Also, that does give him, you might say, very supreme authority to prosecute the campaign. And as someone who was previously dictator and previously a general, he would know that.
I think a lot of people listening to this will already know, but just to say, dictator in the ancient Roman context is not this. It's got very different connotations to a 20th century quote-unquote dictator. It doesn't necessarily mean you're evil or anything. It's just sort of an autocratic...
Well, people who know me will know I take great umbrage at the modern usage of dictator, because I actually think it is actually misused. It's like Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi and Putin are not Marcus Camillus Furius. They're not Quintus Fabius Maximus.
Right, exactly,
and like even then, you're sort of depending on how media represent people, which is another question, but not for this.
And also the word tyrant. I mean, the Athenians, or all sorts of in the Greek world, use the word tyrant. It could be an elected tyrant that was very benevolent.
Yeah.
Couldn't you?
Yeah, exactly.
You could be a very, very good, loved dictator.
Like Dionysius of Syracuse, for instance. Syracuse. Yeah. Exactly.
Just to say that about.
No, of course, because and actually something. I mean, I was meant to probably do this a while ago with Auron, but actually Auron had an idea to talk about that as a stream, and I haven't got around to reading Polybius because I can't do without Polybius.
Okay.
Because it is through that Republican period. You got to think. Quintus Fabius Maximus was dictator twice. Marcus Furius Camillus was dictator, I think, 2 or 3 times. This does occur time and time again, and people can't. The modern mind, for the most part, cannot conceptualize the idea of a group of people nominating a person to hold supreme power for a time, and then that person voluntarily giving that up, which for those amongst your audience or watching this who are American, this is why like the founding fathers revered Cincinnatus.
I was about to mention Cincinnatus.
Sorry,
exactly.
No,
please go ahead.
Predicted you again.
It's just the perfect example, isn't it? It's the example par excellence.
Yeah, he's a senator who's a farmer. Rome has an extremity with one of its neighbours. They announce him as dictator. He destroys the enemy halfway through his tenure. He's like, okay, here's the dictatorship. Here's the scroll. Take it back. Here's the not the scepter, but the fasces. The symbol of dictatorship. Goes back to his farm, gets his plough and his ox, and goes back to work. And then he's like 35 then, and then twice a lifetime later, or not twice, but doubling his age to 70, the new breed of senators. Oh, who's left? Oh, old Cincinnatus is still alive. Let's bring him back. We've been attacked again. And rather than being 35 and young, he's 70 and old. But he defeats the new enemy twice as quickly as he defeated the old enemy. 3 months into his tenure rather than 6. hands it back, goes back to his farm, gets his plough and his oxen, goes. And like I think a lot of men who are sensitive to the idea of perpetual tyranny or sensitive to the idea of sort of an ongoing autocracy or what you might call despotism do revere in a very legitimate way people like Cincinnatus.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's very rare, isn't it? Because quite often,
I admire him for my own sake. Like I think,
me too.
I think the ideal of Cincinnatus is. Like not to be too cynical, but I would sooner elect a Cincinnatus before like any modern day politician.
Yeah. Oh God.
Like,
Yeah. Someone that hasn't been corrupted by power.
I can't imagine like a Rishi Sunak or or like a Morrison or a Howard or a John Major like ploughing a field with oxen. It just doesn't. That's an image I can't conceive of.
Or just giving power up. There's an old adage that, or maybe not an adage, but just the idea that most politicians don't give up on the game of power until it's given up on them. So the idea that
what
you
does Bismarck
very deliberately
say? All political careers end in failure.
Right. Yeah. So the idea that you would very, very deliberately give back power, especially when you don't need to, or earlier than you even expected
to. And in a reverential way.
Yeah.
Like, this thing is sacred.
This is the correct thing to do.
This body is sacred, and this is morally correct, and as an upstanding Roman patriot and a leader of my nation, I will do the correct and upstanding thing in accordance with the ethics of my ancestors, the Mos Maiorum. And just like most people in politics don't even have that thought process.
There's very few examples. I think maybe Diocletian deliberately, consciously abdicated.
Yeah, but he liked his cabbages.
Charles Charles V of Spain. There's a every now and again, someone like Eric Cantona quitting while he's at the top.
Exactly.
Or Rosberg. World champion, and then just quit. So it happens, right? But it's super rare. It's super, super rare. And Cincinnati, if anyone doesn't know, the American town of Cincinnati is named after him. It's just, again, the sort of perfect OG example of it.
George Washington.
He
declined a crown.
No one, declined a crown, and then no one said you've got to stop after 8 years. He just decided that was sort of the correct thing to do. Brilliant stuff.
So because I don't know if we mentioned, but Alia is fought in depending on the calendars, because there's some variation of the old calendars. 390, 387 BC. Marcus Furius Camillus is made dictator, and how that happens is that a messenger is sent into Veii, right? Basically pronouncing his request. Then that same messenger leaves Veii, dodges all these raiding parties and patrols of the Gauls, makes it to the Capitoline Hill, says to the Senate, this is Marcus Furius Camillus' demands, make him dictator and he will lead a relief force. And what is left of the Senate unanimously basically passes this power. And he makes his way back, informs the soldiers of Veii, and then circles all the way back to Ardea and informs Camillus Furius of the answer. So then he is appointed dictator. At this point in time, though, the Gauls find the tracks, and they actually find this sort of back way up the Capitoline Hill, like essentially an escarpment. And what's interesting is that like a sortie is led by a group of like 20, 30 soldiers, and there's just the sentries asleep, because at this point the Romans are in the hilltop, ravaged by lack of provisions. But they haven't killed the sacred geese of the Temple of Juno. And this is what's interesting.
Heaven forbid.
Is the sacred geese of the Temple of Juno are the ones who hear the Gauls climbing up the escarpment and start honking, which wakes up the Roman sentries and they drive the attack away. So this is actually why, like, the goose, for example, is such a revered thing in Roman and also to some extent like Christian history. There's actually a scene in the Russian movie Admiral, the one about Kolchak and the Civil War, when he liberates a town, he's actually given a goose. In the same way that the geese saved Rome, you have saved us from the revolution. Like it has a place in our consciousness, because we consider like geese to be like in some ways sacred to us. They defend us as an animal. Because we so said like dogs with being our guardians, and they are, but like geese have this really odd place because of the mythology of Rome, or the story that comes to us from the Battle of Allia and Brennus and Marcus Furius Camillus. So the Roman sentries drive off this attack on the escarpment. At this point in time, just afterwards, Marcus Furius Camillus leaves Ardea, he goes to Veii, collects the survivors, and all along, all these young Romans are joining his force, vagabonds, mercenaries, he just, and whatever veterans have like, been deployed, in the various little colonies around Latium, drawn to him, he basically constitutes an army, marches to Rome, and at this point in time, the Romans in the hilltop are like literally at the edge of starvation and capitulation, and they're treating with Brennus about surrender, and that's the whole thing about the weights and the Gauls cheating on the weights, and the Romans protesting like, this isn't fair, like, what are you doing? And Brennus, again, half it's probably myth, who knows, but he unsheathes his sword, he throws on the scales, and he says, "Way victus," like, woe to the vanquished, you just accept the terms you're given,
That's a classic line.
Exactly. And another classic line that happens much sooner, because it is said at that very moment, Pyrrhus Camillus arrives at the city, and whether it's like that exact moment, who knows? Probably not, but anyway, the story goes that Pyrrhus Camillus arrives in the city, and he objects to the bartering between the senators and Brennus, and he says, well, you have appointed me dictator, so I'm the one who has sole ability to negotiate. It's up to me. And then the Gauls sort of ask, like, what's your price? And he utters the immortal words, we defend our city and will reclaim the fatherland, not with gold, but with iron. Non auro sed ferro, defendere, defendere orbe e recuperandi la patria. Like something along, I can't remember the exact translation, but something along those lines, which is a very, very enduring motto for the Romans.
Yeah.
The idea that, you don't buy your freedom, you fight for it with weapons and iron. And then at that point, Brennus disengages the siege. His own forces, because of not having provisions, are also weak. They leave Rome. Brennus. Marcus Furius Camillus chases them out of the city. They fight a battle not too far from Alia, and the entirety, well, maybe not the entirety, but the Gallic army is put into flight. Many of their men are massacred, and Brennus falls in battle. Right. And essentially, at that point, he's reappointed dictator. His reputation is entirely restored, and Marcus Furius Camillus is the second founder of Rome and the saviour of the city.
Right. Right. Yeah. And one of the earliest great figures.
And in many ways, a lot. And
does Plutarch do a life of him? I've not seen it. He might do, but I've not ever seen that. Anyway, that's but
not just very quickly. I was going to say, like, when people sort of say, like, oh, who's your favourite person? And I mean, I do this with Caesar, because I'm a massive Julius Caesar fan. But like, we tend to go to, like, Alexander's easy, Hannibal's easy, Caesar's easy, to some degree, Pompey's easy, Pyrrhus is easy, Antigonos is easy, Seleucus is easy. But there's something about Marcus Furius Camillus in this little city-state in this very nascent republic, and the way in which he goes about it. You got to think, like, even in exile, he could have gone, but he was still a patriot at heart, and against odds, he drew, he pushed away and a foreign force of strength and saved his city, and was very much a redeemer and a savior. And I've always had this admiration for Marcus Furius, that's me, for Marcus Furius Camillus, as an individual of antiquity, who's sometimes forgotten in that sort of discussion of great men of antiquity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I suppose one of the next big things, the next big set piece periods of the Roman Republic would be the long extended series of wars with the Samnites then.
The Samnites and other neighbouring peoples, but yes, particularly the Samnites. I mean, you got to think there's 3 Samnite wars.
Right.
And then the Samnites kind of spoil at any opportunity between those wars, and even afterwards, to wrangle with the Romans and have a chance to one-up them or fight against them and quarrel with them, because as other people have said, I think even Carl's mentioned it, is that if the Samnites were almost anywhere else, they probably would have been something resembling a great nation. It just so happens that they were in a collision course with Rome, a nascent Roman Republic. And even though they're cousin peoples, as we sort of spoke about before, you have this, because the Samnites themselves were an Oscan-speaking Sabellian people, rather than the Latin-speaking Romans. They're both of the Italic group of peoples, if you could call them that, or folk, to use the German word. So
the Samnites are almost as badass and stubborn and brutal as the Romans.
In some ways.
Very nearly almost.
Yeah.
They're a match for the Romans.
I was going to say, in some ways, they also have like a more, because obviously Samnium is less urbanized. Like at this point, like Rome is still a relatively small city-state, but everything is concentrating around Rome itself. Whereas Samnium is essentially what do you call, like a confederation, a league of 4 main sort of Samnite people, or people that identify as the Samnites, because they're a group of people, but not a monolith so far. Because just to sort of touch on this for the viewers, because I mean we're talking about Roman Italy in the sense of the word. So like in the north you have Rhaetians and Veneti, who are sort of like these Paleo-Italic people. You have the Gauls who have moved into Cisalpine Gaul, or what we call Cisalpine Gaul, as we spoke about earlier. They displaced the northern environs of the Etruscans who had settled in the Po Valley. You obviously have the Etruscans of Tusia and Etruria, or we call them Etruscans. You have the Umbrians, who are probably more closely related to the Romans and say like the Samnites are, but they're again like an Italic people, distinct from the Romans, but similar. And actually probably one of the few people and places that share their old name with their current name. We have the Umbrians who live in Umbria in Roman times, and yet today we still have the province of Umbria that is populated by Umbrian Italians. Right. Because you'll actually notice, if you look at like an ancient map and a modern map, there's actually quite a few differences in terminology. Then the Senones, who are a Gallic tribe, obviously exist in modern day Marche, which is on the North Adriatic coast, on the east coast of Italy, sort of corresponding with modern day like Pescara and North. Sorry, not Pescara, Rimini. Roman Ariminum. Right. And then sort of you have like this mass in the center, as we talked about before, the Romans, the Latin League, the Latin-speaking Italic peoples, which are the sort of the progenitors of Latin Romance culture and language. It starts on the Tiber Valley, more or less. And then to the south of the Romans, we've talked about the Samnites in part, but we're going to touch on them, now in a very comprehensive way. And you also have these other Oscan-speaking Sabellan people who populate the sort of the Apennine spine of Italy. And then you sort of move further south, you have the Apulians, who are probably a bit of a blend of these Sabellan Oscan people with an intermingling of Greeks, also intermingled with a group of people who were called the Messapians. Now, Messapia is actually quite interesting because they're kind of related to the ancient Dalmatians, as in like the people of like what is now the Dalmatian coast of Croatia, but like ancient Illyrians, who actually settled it is said that they settled the heel of Italy, what is modern day Puglia, or Apulia, if you want to call it that. And you sort of have this Messapian heel, and the Apulians probably intermingled with those people as well. So Apulia, as we sort of understand in ancient times, is very much an intermingled middle territory between sort of 3 clashing cultures. And then you've got the Lucanians and the Bruttians, who are sort of an Italic people who have had a lot of intermingling with the Greek city-states, Tarentum, Tarentum, Brundisium, Crotone, Locri, Hipponion, these Greek sort of cities that are Thurion, these Greek cities that have established, or these Greek settlers who have established Greek polis in what is southern Italy today, and what they call, what the Romans even refer to as Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. And the Lucanians and sort of Bruttians, who those 2 places correspond with modern day Calabria and Basilicata. They populate the sort of like you might say the toe and the foot, the upper foot of Italy, like before you get to the boot. And so Italy is a very different place from what we understand it today, or what we presume it to be. And sort of the Romans play a fundamental part in this, but their great adversary, their great sort of rival in the middle of Italy is the Samnites.
So before Rome can start tangling with
everyone else,
Macedon or Greece or the Persians or the Spanish or the British
or the
Carthaginians, first they've got to basically dominate the Italian peninsula.
Yeah.
Right.
And they're Italic cousins, so to speak.
And the Samnites are just a massive part of that, as you say, and we'll get into it now. But I mean, one thing, I think, overall, is that they die hard, right? It's not easy. Yeah. It's the furthest thing from a walkover, right? The Samnites, I mean, even long after they're basically, quote unquote, subdued, they're still never. They didn't seem to particularly settle under the Roman yoke for a long time.
To the point where even like in the Social War, the one which coincides with
Yes.
Marius and Sulla, the Samnites are still referenced as at least a semi-distinct group of people.
Yeah, they definitely rise up in the social wars. I think even with when Spartacus has some success among the Samnites. Certainly Hannibal does, right?
Oh yes.
So yeah, they were.
Although Hannibal's a lot closer to our time than the other examples, but yeah, exactly, yeah.
But okay, so what are some of the first big or important or noteworthy issues or engagements and things that the Romans and Samnites had? The first Samnite War.
Before like the whole, I just explained ancient Italy thing, we're sort of talking about how the Samnites were not a monolith, but were sort of like this league or confederation of people which we'd call Samnites, and they being a confederate people sort of constituted of four primary groups, what we call the Caracini or the Carachini, I suppose if you want to use strict Latin, the Caudini, the Hirpani and the Pentri. And these people sort of exist in this sort of loose confederation whereby they sort of elected their leaders, sort of not too dissimilar to even like parts of Gaul, like for instance, like the Gallic tribes will sometimes, elect their kings or elect their leaders, or if there's an alliance of tribes that will, for example, selecting Vercingetorix during the rebellion against Caesar, as an example, or was it the leader of the Nervii was Ambiorix? I think I can't remember exactly, but like
there's
they
lots
do.
of Celtic and Germanic peoples that had elected leadership. Yeah.
Exactly. So
Tacitus talks about a lot of the Germans had elected chiefs.
Well, in essence, oh God, Teutoburg Forest, just gone blank. Arminius. Arminius was essentially like a selected leader amongst the Germans. So this tradition, obviously has a place too in non-Roman Italy, and we see. You asked me what the start point is, and it's really a contention over as the Romans move out of what we sort of understand to be modern day Lazio or Latium. The Romans covet, because Rome is already a city that is growing sort of, not at an exponential rate by any point in the imagination, but as a result of consolidating central Latium, the Tiber sort of environs and the Tiber Valley, it has incorporated the Latin League. It is a growing city, and it's a city with a lot of self-confidence, and it moves south into the agricultural territory of what is sort of modern-day southern Lazio, northern, the Campania, which sort of is Naples and north. And you look at some of these cities that were very important at the time, Neapolis, which is modern-day Naples, Cumae, Capua, until really Rome spread out beyond the peninsula, those, particularly Cumae and Capua, were renowned for being like the breadbasket of Rome in the Italian peninsula. And if you sort of go to those parts of the world today, wherever there's flat land, it's beautiful sort of volcanic soil, and they grow abundant crops of anything. And so the Romans obviously figured that this was important for them, and also moving into that Campanian valley sort of protected Rome's southern flank from incursion.
Right.
However, the Samnites also, because they're fundamentally landlocked, that's their access to the sea. That's how they access trade. And because, prior to the Romans moving in, they would have basically dealt with the Greeks, Neapolis and Cumae being particularly Greek polis. Not Roman colonies, but they were Greek colonies, and they would have traded with them independently. And so essentially there's this sort of colliding of interests, essentially like a geopolitical fight, more or less, a geostrategic fight between the Romans and the Samnites, and it draws them towards this sort of this coastal strip. You could probably draw a line from, say, modern day sort of Gaeta, Formia, which is sort of the southern part of Lazio, the very southern part of Lazio, and probably the Amalfi Coast.
All right.
And this is what they squabble over.
Right, yeah. So it's interesting that originally it's, as you say, something like geopolitics or grand strategy.
Geostrategic, yeah.
Geostrategic, right, rather than just some sort of long-lost racial hatred or anything like that.
Yeah.
Or long-lost just enmity for the sake of it, which definitely happens.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly in the ancient world. There was a reason for it. They both coveted the same bit of land, basically, or that they needed to covet it. Again, it wasn't just for honour's sake.
Yeah, yeah.
It was they both sort of needed that bit of land.
They both had compulsion and purpose for doing so, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. exactly. And also too, it's like they both kind of recognise that there is like a fraternity amongst themselves. That's why they sort of, in the number of instances they sort of fight and offer each other peace, there's often actually a lot of clemency involved, which is very unlike Rome later on, for instance, you know?
Yeah.
And we'll get there, obviously. But yeah, sort of, this sort of begins with, in 354, the
BC, just to be clear.
BC, yes, and not BC. The Romans have just sort of essentially consolidated the Latin League. We talked about it before. They sort of, by treaty, which they imposed on their Latin neighbours, this idea that, you know, they have like this binding of strength of the Latin peoples and incorporating them into one physical entity, or like one sort of bureaucratic administrative entity under Roman auspices, and them acknowledging Roman hegemony in that local region. But what occurs is that you've got two tribes. You've got the Sidicini, or the Sidicini, depending on your pronunciation, and the actual companions, whom the region is named after. Because the Italian, like in terms of modern day lexicon or etymology, when an Italian refers to Campania or in Campania, they mean like the country. But there's actually a tribe of people called the Companions, which is what we're sort of like the region Campania is named after. So whether it's like the term for the country is derived from the people, or the place, or the place from the people, like no one really knows. But it's just an interesting kind of etymological quandary that sort of, you know, if you know Italian, you'll understand. And so the Romans sort of essentially they're initially allied with the Samnites, but then there's a bit of horse trading that goes on, and then the Sidicini and the Companions ally with Rome. They kick out their Samnite garrisons and invite the Romans in, and it precipitates basically the first war, and so the Romans achieve their submission of these two cities, of these two localities, and the Romans fight 3 battles against the Samnites in the first Samnite War in 334 BC. The Romans defeat the Samnites at Mons Garius, at Saticula and Suecia, 3 battles that they fight in succession in this sort of region of modern day southern Lazio, northern Campania, and the interesting thing is that in 342 the war's ended, so it's only like a year. It's only like a year or two long war. The Romans prevail. There's a mutually sort of beneficial treaty, mutually sort of satisfactory treaty. The Samnites go their way, the Romans go their way. The Sidicini and the Companions are incorporated into Rome, but the reason why the Romans are so eager for a treaty is because the Latin League is actually in revolt. These newly incorporated allies of Rome are in revolt. And to sort of add an extra twist to the narrative, the Sidicini and the Companions join the Latin League in their rebellion against Rome. So hardly the ink dried on the treaty, where they acknowledge Roman hegemony over northern Campania, these new 2 incorporated localities then join the rebellion against the Latin League. And there's a consequence to this. You could almost call it like the first Latin Civil War in essence. But the Romans sort of crush it between 340 and 338, and the Romans they defeat a combined army of these restless states in revolt at a battle literally on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. And there's an interesting consequence for this that has an impact that rolls on from here, and actually sort of to some degree even impacts the social war, is that all the members of the Latin League are stripped of their right to their own military and diplomatic policy, in essence. They're basically reduced to strict vassaldom, where what they have is like their own sense of citizenship, their own, you know, they can manage their own affairs in terms of their infrastructure or whatever, but their actual diplomatic stance amongst their neighbours and their military function is totally subservient to Rome.
Right. I mean, it is interesting when you look at the later Roman period, because most people know less about this period and probably a bit more about the sort of the from Hannibal onwards, and you think, oh, all of Italy's just sewn up, right? You think, oh, Rome it's
all a big red blob.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah. You think that maybe Rome are just completely brilliant at the business of holding down empire, but it was a long, difficult struggle, as you say, and exactly as you said there. The Italian allies, as they often get called, are sort of more or less constantly, perhaps sometimes with long hiatuses, but more or less always looking to revolt, or got one eye on trying to break away or revolting or something like that. But yeah, so just to put it in some context, it's about this time roughly that Alexander's doing his conquering in the east. Right. The 330s, 320s is when Alexander's doing his thing.
Yeah, because is Granicus 332 or 328, something like that?
Yeah, it's in and around that. Yeah.
Around then, yeah.
The late 320s, early 330s is Alexander largely. So it's just interesting to note. I think sometimes it is worth doing that. You know, if you talk about something's happening in 500 AD, mention in Britain, mention Justinian or something, just to give people an idea. But no, back to Italy. But the Romans are successful though in the First Samnite War. So they are going from merely this collection of villages around these hills to becoming, well, if not one of, almost straight away, kind of the most important power. I mean, by the time they've become a republic, and by the time after the First Samnite War, you couldn't really deny that they're one of the powers of Italy. Now they're not a tiny nobody.
At the very least,
right? They have to be taken seriously by their neighbours by this point.
Well, I was going to say, at the very least, they sort of cross that threshold between they've gone from a local power in which they're dealing with the Sabines, they've destroyed Alba Longa. They're sort of subduing their fellow Latin tribes into this confederation that to which they look up to Rome. Rome submits them, and they're subservient to Rome. To, if not perhaps a regional power of Italy proper, they are certainly a regional power of central Italy.
Right. Yeah.
And they are a force to be reckoned with within their sort of immediate proximity. And no one peoples, the Etruscans, the Umbrians, the Samnites, probably want to take Rome head on at this point. Right. Or if they do take on Rome, it's very much an even fight.
I feel like it's around the Second Samnite War. They would be a headache for anyone already at this point, unless you came over with 100,000 guys.
Literally had Hannibal turned west, not east, for instance. Sorry, not Hannibal. Alexander had turned west, not east.
I was just about to say, if Alexander had rocked up with 60,000 veteran
phalangites,
and another 30,000 Persian cavalrymen that know their business. Yeah. Okay, he might have steamrolled Rome.
And his Hypaspis and his Peltas and all that sort of stuff, yeah.
But any 10, 15, 20,000 Gauls just trying their luck, probably Rome's already a handful, I would have thought.
Much more so than, say, when the Battle of Allia took place.
Right.
Which is, 100 years before, or 60 years before, 80 years before.
Yeah. Okay, so Second Samnite War?
Yeah, so the Second Samnite War, this is where the Romans begin to, you might say, it's probably the first instance of them truly betraying what they would call the Mos Maiorum. Okay. And the Romans sort of acting in a manner that's a little undignified, perhaps a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a little bit advantageous, like almost in a dishonourable sort of sense. Right. And the Romans establish a settlement, a colony at a place called Fregele, which is, and you can actually travel there today. It's actually a very pretty part of Lazio. It's one I'm very familiar with, due to sort of family reasons. But the Liri River and the Liri Valley is a very definitive landmark between sort of two parts of Lazio, and in fact, really, to some degree, was the dividing line between what you call like Laziale or Roman culture and Neapolitan culture, because it's just such a geographic kind of distinction. Okay. And as a result, probably once we get to the First Samnite War, and then sort of through this First Samnite War and its culmination, the Liri Valley ends up being sort of this natural dividing line between this is Samnium, this is Romanorum, like this is Rome, this is the Samnites. These are the Romans, these are the Samnites, and this is the dividing line. And the Romans, in their infinite wisdom, in 328 BC, they establish Fregele on the southern eastern bank of the Liri Valley, like in total contradiction of their previous treaty with the Samnites. And the Samnites like, whoa, what's going on here? This is our side of the river, and that itself doesn't actually trigger a war as such. But
so you don't accidentally do something like that.
No, that's right.
It's not by accident. Oops. Accidentally settled on this side.
It's like, we have palisades and insula, a trading post, and a forum. Oh no, that just materialized in the ether. No, exactly. So it's a premeditated thing that the Romans do to sort of, you might say, antagonize the Samnites. And the other things we talked about, like the two cities, or the Sidicini and the companions beforehand. In 326, 2 years later, there's like a pro-Roman faction in Neapolis, modern day Naples, and they expel their Samnite garrison and they invite the Romans into the city. And at that point, the Samnites say, "No more, we're not having this," because really, once with the loss of Cumae and Capua, Naples is essentially like the last real proper trade port that the Samnites have access to, because again, like I said, they are essentially landlocked as a people, and no one's really trading through the eastern spine, like through the Adriatic. All the Greek cities are sort of on the southern part of Italy and along the southwestern coast. Basically, like I said before, like the Amalfi Coast, places like Salerno, or modern day Salerno, modern day Naples, modern day Capri, which the Greeks founded as Pithecusia, for example. And then, of course, you have all these Greek cities in Sicily, Messina, Syracuse, Taormina, etc. And these cities all trade amongst each other, and then all these cities are trading with Greece. So these are all very important trade nodes, and the Samnites are about to lose the only one that they really have proper access to. Because for them to actually then trade south, like through Tarentum or Bari or Brundisium or Crotone, for instance, they basically have to go through the Lucanians and the Bruttians, which means that they don't have direct access to the trade. They're at the behest of others. Right. So Naples is the last direct trading hub they have. So thus starts the second Samnite war between them. And the Samnites are in a much more, shall I say, aggressive posture than the first war, which kind of happened by accident, but they are now actually antagonized by the Romans in a very real sense on their doorstep.
And from their point of view, it would be more desperate, right? It's a true existential threat for them now. Yeah. They're being strangled now.
A true geopolitical conundrum for them, you might say, or geostrategic conundrum. But if you can apply a modern term to it,
At the expense of stating the obvious, it's a lovely part of the world.
It is.
I mean, I've been to Naples a couple of times, been to Rome a bunch of times, been up and down the Amalfi Coast and Salerno, been to Capri and stuff, and just absolutely lovely. And I'm sure it was then. I'm sure it was then.
A place you wouldn't mind washing up on the beach on if you were shipwrecked, right?
Yeah.
There's far worse places to wind up, right?
It's funny, quite often when when you're on holiday in very, very picturesque places, it's sometimes easy to forget that they're battlefields all around you.
Yeah, like mountains of bodies have been here at some point.
Right. Yeah. You're staying in Salerno and you're like, was there massacres here? Yeah, there were, yeah.
There was certainly beach landing about 75 years ago,
Yeah. Talk about the 20th century, yeah.
I believe Pink Floyd wrote a song about it,
Yeah. Didn't Pink Floyd's father die at Anzio?
One of the two, I can't remember.
One of the guys, I can't remember which one. But anyway.
It was Anzio or Salerno, but I can't remember,
the Second Samnite War. How's that go down?
Yeah, so in the first year of the war, the Roman consul of that year, Quintus Rullianus, was advancing through their foothold, their bridgehead across the Liri, march into sort of the western environs of Samnium, and they win a victory at a place called Ibrinium. But it's not decisive. It's a fantastic win, but certainly not decisive. It doesn't knock the Samnites out of the war. And the Samnites sort of retreat to their mountain strongholds. They engage in something resembling a guerrilla conflict. And after about 3-4 years, the Samnite tribes, rather than acting sort of as independent entities, they sort of go to that elected leader sort of mentality, and they elect a man by the name of Gaius Pontius. And this is actually quite important because this comes to one of the great sort of, you might say, the great allegories that are associated with Rome. And so Gaius Pontius rallies the tribes. They raise more men from their what do you call it, tribal levy, and they attempt to go onto the front foot, and they rally their forces at a place called Caudium, which coincides with the Caudini, one of the tribes I mentioned. And what's intriguing is that if you sort of know the battle already, those names are popping into your head. So the Romans were camped at a place called Calatia, which is sort of on the entry to this, what do you call, like a geographical feature. And the Romans broke their camp and marched towards the Samnite position. And one of Gaius Pontius's sort of tactics was that he released a bunch of men to sort of pretend to be shepherds. And they sort of inform on the camp on purpose, like, oh, the army's over here, and we don't want trouble. We're just shepherds, and if you go over there, you can win the fight, sort of thing. And they march through what's essentially partial ravine, partial defile, surrounded by sort of shrubbery and almost like semi-cliffs in a sense. And the Romans, as they always did, particularly in their early times, favoured speed over complicated manoeuvre, just march through this geographical feature called the Caudine Forks. And kind of in you might say like a proto-Trasimene sense, the Romans will march straight into this trap. They see part of the Samnite army in front of them, and so the consuls try to turn around and go back to where they were, but there's another portion of the Samnite army behind them, and then sort of a bit like that scene from Braveheart where they're sort of on the top of the cliffs with the sling, and it's like they're on top with all their flags and stuff. The Samnites are jeering and throwing stuff at the Romans, and the Romans are like, wow, we're surrounded. And it was basically a consular army. It was a very large Roman army for its time. And I think it was two consuls. It was actually a substantial force for Rome in you're talking like the very early 1200s, late 1300s BC. The Romans are totally surrounded because one of the reasons they were drawn into this trap is that the Samnites or the shepherds sort of said, you have there's a city, Luceria, that the Samnites have besieged. You have to get there quickly to save them. The Romans just swallow the bait straight out. They get caught in this defile and they're stuck in the Caudine Forks. And
sorry, just let me cough so I don't cough over you. Cut that out in post. Sorry, I didn't want to cough over you.
No. All good. No. I realised you were struggling there. And so the two Roman consuls, Calvinus and Albinus, were just shocked at the fact that they just marched straight into this trap. They just were lulled in. They completely took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. No scouting, nothing. And sort of then
that is one of the Romans' blind spots for
sometimes.
Centuries.
And particularly
on and off, not always,
and particularly early in the history.
Early on.
Yeah.
Not always, but multiple occasions. So you had not one scout.
Yeah.
You didn't have one outrider.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. And it's like those 10 shepherds, you didn't beat one of them, to make sure they weren't telling lies, But anyway, and this is the thing too. They the two consuls and the military leadership were sort of debating, how do we extricate ourselves out of this mess?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, on the other side, the Etruscans, the Samnites are almost stumped that they've lured the entire Roman army into this trap. They thought, maybe we can ambush half of them or a portion of them or kill the vanguard, but no, the entire Roman army is just marching into this defile and have them surrounded. And this sort of leads to one of the great sort of historical allegories regarding Rome and one of the great stories of antiquity, not just Italian antiquity, but European antiquity, writ large. And he was so startled, was Gaius Pontius, at his situation that he sort of sent for his father, who was a retired, basically, tribal leader of the Samnites, his father Aeneas, asking for his advice about what to do. He's like, well, I have all these captured Romans, what do I do with them? And Aeneas, according to the history, which I believe Polybius covers this, rode out to where the army was, where the allied sort of Confederate Samnite army was, and he just offered his wisdom to his son and to the military leadership of the Samnites, and just said, well, he bluntly suggested, it's like, well, you have literally two choices. You either kill all the Romans, like every single one of them, or you let them go. That's your two alternatives, because each one confers an advantage. Either you weaken the Romans so dramatically that they will not be a threat for a generation, possibly two, or else we have been allies up until now for the most part. We earn their friendship, and our clemency is seen as a gesture of goodwill, and perhaps we can retain our friendship with the Romans. And Pontius and the tribal leaders sort of talking amongst themselves, thinking this old man is crazy, he's talking nonsense. Surely there must be a moderate path. And this is like one of the great philosophical examples of treading the middle path being the worst option, right?
Yeah.
Because they don't necessarily want to perform a massacre. They don't want to, commit essentially like what's what I'm looking for, like not a war crime, but the word I'm looking for, a heinous act of barbarism.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, it's like, well, if we just let them go, what if they turn back on us and kill us? Yeah. So Aeneas, his famous reply is these sort of infamous words. he says to his son and the tribal leaders, he says, "The Romans are a nation who know not how to remain quiet under defeat. Whatever disgrace this present extremity burns into their souls will rankle there forever and allow them no rest until they've made you pay for it many times over." Which in some ways is kind of indicative, like, of some aspects of the modern Italian mindset in terms of like how Italians behave going forward as a people in a way. And if you're sort of familiar with, if a person's familiar with, say, like the what do I call it, the writing and literature that's associated with, say, like the mafia or something like that, or the Cosa Nostra, and the idea of like a vendetta. You know, it's that same idea that like it sits there and it rankles and rankles and it eats at people, and like they have to satisfy their sense of revenge. You know, like they can't just let it go. Like the idea of Zen would be alien to the Romans, and would be alien to like some mafia capo or a consigliere. You know, like there's this idea that just it just eats away at them, and there's nothing but a desire to settle the score. And this is shown as far back as the Second Samnite War, and Aeneas, in his dialogue with his son and the Samnite leadership, exemplifies this point. You know.
You know, there is definitely the idea of vendetta. That the Romans will pay you back and then some. Yeah, it's funny actually. I was listening to some Gibbon the other day, as I sort of always am, on and off. There's a bit from much later. It was during the earlier life or reign of Diocletian, where Gallienus says something to one of the Parthians. Once they get the Parthians, he says, "The Romans have never been unnecessary, never been cruel to their capture, to their enemies. We've always been extremely reasonable to our enemies." I'm like, whoa, what a fib! What a fib! Or like, we're always very, very clement and reasonable. No, you're not. You hardly ever are.
I was going to say he took a note out of Sulla almost. You know how Sulla has a famous quote about, you know, "No friend has ever helped me, nor enemy ever wronged me that I have not repaid in full." Yeah. And again, that's probably like an example of this. You know, it's the example of, you know, you're either my friend or this will rankle in me forever, and I will literally tear your city down brick by brick, you know, for satisfaction's sake, you know. It's
interesting psychology though, because it's funny how collectives of people do often act. The psychology is often very, very similar to an individual person. Like even at the modern UN, whole nations, even whole blocks of people behave basically as though they're in a playground. The psychology side of it, anyway. You must know what it's like in real life when there's someone that you're like, okay, I'll do anything now to get back at you.
Yeah.
Like I'll burn down my entire life in order just to stab at you.
Yeah.
And the Romans, have got that. It doesn't take much to get them in that place.
No, certainly not.
So what did the Samnites choose to do?
So the Samnites choose to not adhere to the wisdom of Aeneas, and Pontius and his fellow leaders of the army choose to march. Well, the Romans do attempt actually a few sorties to get out of the ravine, but they're sort of repulsed each and every time, and they sort of know that their situation is precarious. Because the other thing is too, they don't have much in the way of supplies. They can't even like build a fort and defend themselves. And this is a very, very, you got to think, this is the pre-Manipular Legion too. Yeah. So they're still Roman hoplites in a sense, and they don't have the war wagon and the materials that would carry them as they would have done later, which the Romans were famous for being almost like marching soldier engineers in a sense. This is well before that time. And so they treated with Pontius and accepted his moderate terms, and in order to spare their lives and to make sure that there wasn't a massacre, the Romans were forced to march under a yoke of spears, heads bowed in like recognition of their defeat, and the Samnites retained 600 of the leading Roman equites, the Roman aristocrats essentially, the son of aristocrats, as captives to guarantee the peace, because the Samnites made them surrender Lucaria and Fregellae and these contested cities on the border. So very much so, without really much in the way of shedding blood, aside from that first battle that the Romans did win, the Samnites almost scored like a bloodless war victory against the Romans in the second Samnite War, and the Romans are actually very much humiliated, and their prestige is damaged, probably for the first time in a comprehensive sense since the catastrophe of Alia.
Yeah, it's interesting that the Romans are not undefeated, right? There's all sorts of peoples throughout history who like to think of themselves as undefeated, like the Americans often try and claim.
Like, you know.
Yeah, yeah. But the Romans, over the centuries, lost loads of times. I also think of like a battle-hardened boxer that's like he's got 45 wins under his belt, but like 8 losses.
Yeah.
He's tasted defeat. He knows what it means to be knocked out.
But like 90%,
right?
but 90% of his wins are also KOs. Like.
Oh yeah. Still a great boxer, but because I always think there's something.
And he's got, like, you can tell he's got the cuts on his face. He's got like a chipped lip, teeth missing. Yeah, he's a warhorse, you know.
But when boxers or MMA fighters or whatever, when they're undefeated, unless they get their whole career undefeated, like Joe Calzaghe or whatever, or Mayweather,
or Mayweather,
that hardly ever happens.
Yeah.
Most guys, they might get a stretch of the way through their career undefeated. I always do think that they're not a full package yet, though, and it's the same in life, like having lost someone you love or having been dumped by someone you were still in love with. Like, you're not really a complete rounded person yet because you've never tasted.
There's a glory in the overcoming.
What it means, yeah. You've never been at the bottom of a trough. You've never been knocked out. You don't know what that means. But when you do, you become an experienced, well-rounded.
This isn't obviously a philosophy chat, right? But Seneca touches on it, and that and in Stoic philosophy they do say that for a man, or person, but for a man to have never tasted sort of sadness or sorrow, or I can't remember exactly what the word is, but it's like he says it is to be ignorant of one half of human life, and I actually truly believe that that's the case. I'd like to be constantly blessed and to never suffer a loss is to just like in some ways like Genghis Khan was technically he was undefeated, but was Genghis Khan so was Alexander technically. But like in some ways, does that actually make Hannibal greater or Caesar greater or Belisarius greater? Because then they overcome the adversity. Caesar's triumph at Alesia is made greater because of his bloody nose at Gergovia.
Right, yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
The Roman victory of the annexation of Gaul is made great because of the Romans' legion that was, cut off and massacred outside Lutetia.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no,
there's something to that,
No, I completely agree. Like the Romans know the game; they've been round the block, right? So
they're like George Foreman coming back at 42,
yeah, no, exactly. Just quickly to go back to the second Samnite one. That ravine does remind me of, although the outcome is completely different, but it reminds me of when the Athenians get trapped in a quarry in Sicily on the Sicilian expedition.
Oh yeah, outside of Syracuse.
Yeah, of course the outcome is very, very much worse in the Athenian one.
Nicias wasn't quite so lucky.
Right, yeah. In the Athenian one, they all end up essentially dead. I think 1 or 2 people survived, but essentially all dead. But there's the idea that you can trap a large body of men in a ravine or a quarry, and they're done. They're done.
Comparable to when the Spartiates were captured. I can't remember what battle was in the Peloponnesian War. The Spartan aristocrats, the Athenians captured them on the outskirts of... You know the one I'm talking about. I can't remember the exact same battle, but I can't remember the name. But and it's like, well, this is our military elite. If we're massacred, it's all over. We're like the breeding stock of the Spartan army.
Well, there's a bit in the Hannibal where Hannibal is sort of trapped, I think by Fabius, I might be wrong, in some sort of ravine or valley, but he gets out via guile. The bit where.
Nora with the ox heads.
With the fire on the ox horns.
And then the oxen release one way and he goes down the other path in the valley. Yeah, it's outside of Nora.
But it's just interesting that's a real thing, that you can trap even a whole army in a valley, and it's extremely easy to keep them penned in there.
Yeah.
You'd think people that were aware of that would be more wary about allowing themselves to be trapped in such a thing. But anyway, there you go.
And it's one of those things too where really the Romans, as they adapted and as their army transformed, became far better at this. Like for instance, I know it's technically a different entity, but if you actually look to say the heading towards the East Roman era, like there's actually probably a period from say like Constantine to maybe like the Arab Wars where the Romans actually never suffer any kind of ambush. Because they actually do have a sophisticated system of intelligence gathering, of scouting, light cavalry, heavy cavalry. And it's only really once like the East Romans start getting like monstered by the Bulgarians and the Balkans that they start being ambushed again. But that's a whole different kettle of fish, obviously.
No, for a long time the a long time, the later Romans and the earlier Byzantines have got it down pat. But to begin with, in this Republican period, like Hannibal, like Trasimene, you didn't have one picket. You didn't have one flying picket out there. That's crazy. That's almost unbelievable. But there you go. Okay.
Exactly.
So the Romans sort of live there's sort of rather a whole generation of men aren't massacred at this stage.
Humiliated, but not massacred.
Right. But even a humiliation for the Romans they'll never ever forget it.
No.
So how much time passes between what's the next sort of stage?
Sorry, I just had to check this because it's going to drive us and probably the viewers mad. Battle of Sphacteria, 300 Spartan hoplites were captured. And they were like Spartiates. Yeah, Sphacteria, that's correct.
This is in the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah, Peloponnesian War, Right. Sorry, anyway, let's continue.
Yeah.
So, basically they're humiliated, and there's an after effect of this humiliation. It actually, a bit like earlier, some transformations happened under Marcus Furius Camillus. This triggers a complete redo of the Roman army. The Romans very much come to the realization that the Greek way of fighting, this sort of hoplite formation, with round hopalon shields and spears, it didn't work against the Gauls that well. It offers no distinction against the Etruscans, and the Samnites are superior fighters in the Apennines. They're more lightly armored, they're more dynamic. The infantry's lighter. The heavy shield and armor is unwieldy in the mountain passes of central Italy, and the Romans, as they often prove time and time again, are willing to look to themselves or within themselves and go, we have to change the way we do things. And the Romans completely reinvent their army. This is the first transformation of the Roman army. And what we see is the origins, the beginnings of the Manipular army, what you might even call the Polybian Legion, to some extent. Because Camillus has reforms. You sort of have like this chameleon reformation that's minor, but the Romans still fight in that hoplite, spear-bound way. But the Polybian Legion, like the sort of legion that comes to the fore and is conceived of after the Second Samnite War, the Romans dispense with that entirely. They dispense with the, you might call it the somewhat irregular, somewhat informal gens system and the levy system that they had, and they bring about this sort of manipular, you could almost call it like a city-state militia system, and they create the idea of the legion, and you have the various classes. You have the velites, the skirmishers, the hastati, the young men, the principes, the sort of middle-aged veteran men, the triarii, the old grizzled veterans, and they're the ones who are only armed with spears and who sort of fight in the old-fashioned way. And then you have like other classes that are sort of a little bit lost in translation, like rarii, and they're sometimes slingers, they're sometimes javelineers, we don't really know. But the Romans, organize it by class, by strata, by age. And these men no longer fight in a phalanx, aside from the triarii occasionally, but more spear wall. But these are essentially swordsmen, and they fight in this manipular sort of triples acies formation. And you sort of had the creation of, we call it a centurion, but it's technically 80 men. And they're led by a rudimentary sense, sort of like this is where the idea of the centurion is almost born. The centurion is more formalized later on as the army is professionalized, but the idea that like a group of men are led by an officer, and that officer, a number of these, I think it was 2 centuries make a maniple, if memory serves me correct, 2 or 3 make a maniple, and then this maniple is a fighting unit in itself, and it resembles a sort of a collection of forces, and they organize and they have their own tactics, and they're meant to sort of fight semi-independently, and this is where that seed of what we understand to be Roman tactics begins, is in the aftermath of the Second Samnite War.
Right. And this lasts largely up until Marius.
Yes.
Right.
With a few adaptations, but yes.
Yeah, a few adaptations, but it serves them well, right? I mean, because that period between the Second Samnite War and Marius, that whole period is the period of them dominating Italy and beyond.
Well, becoming masters of the Mediterranean.
So it serves them very well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, it's sort of unparalleled.
Well, they conquered Greece with it.
Unstoppable.
They conquered Greece with it.
Right.
They vanquished Carthage with it. Yeah. So in essence, in the aftermath of Caudine Forks, the Samnites, or the Romans and the Samnites, agreed to a 5-year truce. And as we said, the phalanx and the old military system is dispensed with, and we have this new manipular system. Of course, the moment the treaty expires, the Romans renew hostilities in 315 BC. And
it's good of them even to wait until it actually
very
formally
very
expired.
very polite of the Romans, you know. But, you know, again, as they did in the first two wars, they drove into Samnium. The Romans captured Saticula. And although that being said, this is where like the Samnite sort of tenacious spirit does shine through. They counterattack the Romans and they defeat them at a place called Lautule, which is not far from modern day Formia, I think, like near the coast. But the Romans send the dispatch reinforcements and they attack them again, and they defeat the Samnites at a place called, well, they call it the Tarracina, but it's modern day Terracina. It's the same place. It's sort of between, you might say, Rome and what is Formia, or Gaeta, sort of around there. Sort of like south central Lazio. And then the Romans, once they put the main Samnite army into flight, they capture Luceria or Lucaria and they recover Fregele. So basically all the losses from the Second Samnite War are reversed.
Right.
And really at this point, the Romans have completely solidified their hold over this contested region of, you know, northern Campania, you know, Cumae, Capua, the places they first squabbled over in the First War. The Romans have almost completely solidified this. The Romans then use it as an opportunity to build the Appian Way, which obviously has a trade purpose, has a military purpose. You know, the Romans are then able to really take the fight to Samnium and put them on the back foot almost permanently. The Etruscans do intervene at the very tail end of the war in 310 BC, but they're defeated at a place called Vadimo. And this also has implications because it also ties into the experience with the Roman relationship with the Gallic tribes of Salpine Gaul, because the Gauls actually send a contingent to fight alongside the Etruscans, but they are crushed at Vadimo. And basically the Gauls don't fight the Romans for 50 years after Vadimo. So that's in 310 BC, and then by 304, despite having fought very gallantly in the hilltop fortresses of central Italy, throughout the hinterland of Samnium, they got to the ends of their tether and they asked the Romans for peace, and that is the end of the Third Samnite War, by which, as you could say, is probably the last war where they fight on something resembling even terms.
Yeah, no, never before did the Samnites, is it anything other than a lost cause, right? Or rather, the Samnites would have to team up with a whole bunch of other people in some sort of coalition for it to be even remotely feasible.
Which is what happens from here on in. So whether whether we're talking about Telamon is essentially a battle between the Romans and Gauls specifically, but whether we're talking Sentinum, or whether it's the Pyrrhic War, whether it's Hannibal, whether it's even the Social War, there's always either a distinct foreign entity or a wider collective circumstance to which the Samnites then attach themselves. But never as a collective singular force are they able to really fight the Romans, face to face again, toe to toe, to use a boxing analogy.
And by the time we get to the 5th century AD...
It's more of a Royal Rumble against the Romans.
All right, yeah. But for example, by the time we get to the actual fall of Rome in like the early 5th century AD...
So, 410, 476, yeah.
They don't really exist anymore, really, in Samnites, would you say?
Samnium is a place.
Right. It's not that they don't exist. It's not that they've been wiped off the earth or they've been genocided into nothing. Not that, but...
They've been amalgamated into Rome.
Okay. They've been thoroughly absorbed, maybe is a thing to say, by that point.
Yeah.
Right, so...
A bit like the Etruscans in that sense too, and the Umbrians.
Right,
Because you got to think, even up until, say, the time of even Caesar... even the first sort of / second triumvirate, to a lesser extent the second, Etruscan was still kind of spoken in Etruria. I mean, I don't know this as a matter of fact, but I mean, to some degree, you'd imagine that particularly in like the hilltops of places like Beneventum or Bovianum, like these sort of hilltop places, Sabellan and the Oscan languages were probably still spoken amongst peasants and like real holdout communities. Yeah. But then if you sort of fast forward to, even the time of, say, Aurelian, the crisis of the 3rd century, as languages often do, if they're not perpetuated, and they're encumbered by a very strong, overbearing culture, and invariably they do vanish. And the fate of Oscan and these Sabellan languages, also these Oscan languages and the Sabellan people and their distinct identity kind of just fades over time and evaporates, much like Etruscan. Yeah, so really from that point onwards, sort of following the Third Samnite War, the Samnites are very in a position. They're still at this point technically an independent people. They haven't like been crushed by Rome or occupied as such, but they are very much weakened, and Rome is so much more ascendant that the idea of the Samnites fighting toe to toe is nigh impossible. And really, from a period of say 302 to 302 to 298, the Romans at this point, they kind of feel as if their southern flank and the southern flank predominantly, but also like the Apennine interior is fairly safe. The Samnites, their war waging capacity is fairly curtailed. And what the Romans do is end up basically rotating north. So things have been quiet against the Etruscans and the Umbrians, and the Romans are basically launching annual campaigns with their consuls, sending consular armies up into the north. And that territory that, say, Camillus Furius captured after, or around the time of the Battle of Alia, either side of it, Faleri, not Clusium, what was the other one? I mentioned it when I was here last, but those two cities and they use that as basically like a spear tip to push their way north, and they push their way out the tail end of the Tiber Valley and into the sort of northern central interior of Italy, to the point where like the Umbrians are almost, as an independent people, are almost conquered, and the size of Etruria as sort of like this sort of collective people is almost trimmed down by a third, and the Romans are just relentless in their sort of these attacks and these campaigns and their conquest of these cities.
Because at this time, war pays, right? In our modern world, war is fantastically expensive. You're running at a deficit if you're going to go to war. It's going to cost you loads of money. But in the ancient world, in the pre-modern world, often, certainly in the ancient world, quite often it's the other way around. No, you make money out of war.
Well,
you just steal everything, and it's all profit.
Well, what did Cicero say? That the sinews of war is infinite money.
Right. Yeah.
And you got to think too, like how many of the more traditional Roman politicians, I'm talking, Cato the Elder, for instance, Cicero to an extent, and some of these commentators such as Florus and Sallust, looked at the Roman conquest of the East and basically said, this is what is spoiling us, this is destroying our morals. You got to think the acquisition of the treasury at Pella, I think quintupled or quadrupled the Roman treasury, the Roman, war chest, like overnight after they destroyed the Antigonid kingdom. And then of course, the idea that Egypt would bring in something in the order of like, what was it? I think like 260 million sestertia a year into like the tax revenues. Like the Romans of Furius Camillus or even Quintus Fabius Maximus would have boggled the mind to them. Like, could you imagine how many pila we can make with these sestertia?
There's one thing again in the age of Diocletian.
And a part of that sort of that origin point, that concern starts even then. You know what I mean?
Yeah. There's one line again in Gibbon talking about Diocletian, just because I've listened to it recently, that he started taxing the city of Rome itself on some sort of basis. And the Romans,
for the first time, because they're never being taxed.
The Romans hadn't paid anything for 500 years, ever since they conquered Macedonia. The Romans had been exempt. The Romans themselves.
Well, Latia as a province was exempt.
500 years.
I think,
So, anyway.
Yeah. No, exactly. And so they were shocked when it happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, as a result of this sort of act of expansion, actually, just as a side point, Cicero said that the sinews of war is infinite money. Machiavelli countered that by saying that the sinews of war is good soldiers, which the Romans actually proved true on both counts, funnily enough.
Yeah, fair point.
I think it was Machiavelli, but anyway. So as a result of the Roman sort of the relentless Roman incursions north against the Umbrians and the Etruscans, the Samnites sort of resolved to actually somehow improve their own position, and in doing this, they end up attacking southwards towards the Lucanians. And so that gives the Lucanians an excuse to send embassies to Rome, basically saying help, and the Romans are all too happy to oblige. Yeah. And so all the Romans really do is offer an ultimatum to the Samnites to evacuate Lucania. Right. And the Samnites probably would have been wise to have just retreated, but they didn't. And so the last war broke out between them. Samnium is not fighting alone here. There's actually something of a coalition that does occur here, because in the end the Romans are already technically fighting the Umbrians and the Etruscans. So there's the Samnites that have now sort of entered this wider conflict. The Lucanians and Campanians join the Romans, obviously, as allies. And just sort of northeast of all this is the Senones, who are obviously Brennus's old tribe, who marched on Rome during the Battle of River Allia, and they're looking with a degree of trepidation about this massive.
They're Gauls, really, right?
They are Cisalpine. They're the most southerly of the Cisalpine Gauls.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So if you sort of look at a map of modern day Italy, the majority of these Gauls are in the Po Valley, are in what the Italians call Piedmonte and modern day Lombardy, in that sort of northern part.
Modern day Italy.
Yeah.
It's modern day Italy.
Yeah.
But they're Gallic people.
Oh, I'm just describing the locality in which they
Sure,
were.
Yeah.
But the Senones are actually a little bit further south and to the east, like modern day Italian, the modern day province of Marche.
Right.
That's where the Senones were. So they were quite literally, with the possible exception of the Galatians in Anatolia, the most southern Gauls that exist.
Right. Yeah.
And like I said, being the tribe of Brennus, Rome was a much smaller place when Brennus marched on it in 390 BC. But, fast forward now to 295, Rome's a very different animal. And the Senones are thinking, this is a bit disconcerting. And so we're sort of leading towards the Battle of Sentinum here. And much like they did with Gaius Pontius, the Samnites elect another war leader by the name of Gellius Ignatius. And Gellius Ignatius makes a very courageous call, actually, to march away from his home territory. He abandons, the city's a garrison, but he more or less takes the army out of Samnium and marches north to join the Umbrians and the Etruscans. And at that time, they also talked the Senones into joining this coalition. So it's a very formidable coalition. You're talking, by the time that these armies are all brought together, you're talking 40, 50,000.
Right, oh, brilliant. Huge.
And you got to think...
It's huge.
Yeah, so at Allia, 100 or so years ago, Rome was barely able to field maybe, 12, 15, maybe 16,000 men against the Gauls. 100 years later, the Romans are going to match a coalition of their Italian enemies, almost man for man. Sentinum ends up being a battle of something in the order of 35, 40,000 men aside.
It's massive. You look at something like the English Civil War. Sometimes it's 8,000 aside. Less. Sometimes it's 5,000 v 3,000.
Yeah.
And that's a full battle.
Yeah.
That's one of the big set-piece battles in the English Civil War. So these are giant battles.
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously not anything compared to sort of World War I or the Eastern Front in World War II, of course, dwarfed by that. But in the scheme of things, in the scheme of pre-modern world,
certainly
massive.
By the scale of certainly Napoleonic warfare, and possibly 30 Years' War numbers, yes, huge. Yeah. Some of the numbers that are coming out of antiquity are mind-boggling. You sort of think around this time, or just before this time, but around this time, the Battle of Ipsus being fought between the Antigonids, Demetrius and Antigonus with Pyrrhus. And then on the other side, you have the coalition of Lysimachus and Seleucus and Ptolemy. Each side has 75, 80,000 men. It's gargantuan-sized battles.
Right, yeah. They are Napoleonic era-sized battles.
Almost.
Getting there.
Yeah,
getting there, anyway.
Getting there, exactly.
A mid-size, that's a decent mid-size Napoleonic battle, that is.
What's bigger? Borodino, Austerlitz, Leipzig, Waterloo?
Yeah, a handful.
A handful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Many Napoleonic battles that aren't even that big. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And you're talking 300 years before the birth of Christ. It's actually monumental when you think about it,
Yeah.
So these forces coalesce around a place called Sentinum, and the Romans and this is where the Romans actually start to become a little bit strategic in their thinking. And this is again the genesis of, you might call, Roman strategic warfare. The Romans dispatch a smaller force to raid, or to attack Etruria and Umbria, and so the Umbrians and the Etruscans, who about 30-40% of the army, end up retreating from the battlefield, wanting to defend their homes. And so this coalition is already falling apart to begin with. And so what you have is 4 Roman legions, 4 allied Italic legions, and they're sort of on the field of Sentinum. They offer battle. The Samnites and the Gauls wait for 2 or 3 days for their friends to return. The Umbrians and the Etruscans, they do not return. So they then, and as the Romans have been doing with their own cavalry, they've been harassing because the Samnites and nor the actual mainland Gauls were actually quite good with cavalry, but the Cisalpine Gauls less famous for cavalry. So actually, those are one of the few times in Italy the Romans actually have a cavalry advantage. And the Romans are harassing them, draw them into battle. And the Romans are led by Publius Decius Mus, who was one of the consuls, the other consul being Quintus Rullianus, and they sort of lead the left and right wing specifically. And this is actually where you sort of see one of the legends of Rome. The grandfather of Scipio Africanus, Lucius Scipio, is the reserve commander with a token force at the back. And this battle is actually quite sort of famous because Decius Mus is the son of a general who committed devotio against in one of the battles in the Latin War. So basically, the devotio is this idea that a Roman commander might see a battle turning against him, and sort of he offers a promise to the troops, and he curses the enemy standards and rides amongst the enemy and is killed, and that's meant to inspire his men to action.
A very deliberate suicide.
Literally deliberate suicide, but with shall I say spiritual connotations, because the Romans are a very suspicious people and a very you might say auspicious people, to the extent that when they actually, as an aside, when they actually annex Samnium and they take their capital, Beneventum, modern-day Benevento, it's actually initially called Maleventum, but if you're aware of Latin language and prefixes, male is bad. Right. Like malevolence.
Yeah.
Bene being the Italian word for good, we get from which we have beneficial, benefit, etc. Yeah. The Romans actually changed the name because they're so wary and suspicious about it. They changed the name to Beneventum. Anyway. Initially Decius Mus has success on his flank with his cavalry, but he's eventually surrounded by being overly eager, and his own flank is sort of the Gauls are very, as we know, they're ferocious people. They're very very warrior-spirited people, and the Romans are still getting a hang of their manipula system as well. They're sort of still early days for them, and his flank gets pushed back, and a part of him decides most of his cavalry's been surrounded and destroyed, and he's sort of mostly on his own. And he curses the standards of the Gauls, and he throws himself into the thickest part of the line, and then he's obviously brought down very quickly by the Gauls. But it makes his flank rally. At that point in time, Lucius Scipio sends a few reserve cohort of reserve maniples to sort of support the flank. And at this point in time, Rullianus has been a bit more perceptive and a bit more reserved in his tactics. He's been more defence orientated and allowed the Samnites to tire themselves out. And then eventually the Romans send in the remnants of their reserves, surround the two armies. The Samnites end up breaking and running, but the Gauls, being the Gauls, tend to fight on. And both sides of the army, Rullianus and Scipio, and although Decius Mus has perished, his side, they basically clamp behind the Gauls and massacre them to the man. And really, with the Battle of Sentinum in 295 BC, we really see the last genuine gasp of the Samnites. And from that point on, the Romans march into Samnium and sort of more or less incorporate Samnium into the Republic. And from that point on, Samnium becomes a place, but the Samnite people, as we know, wriggle on, and they will come to join the banners of Pyrrhus and Hannibal and almost anyone else who's willing to tempt fate with Rome. Okay,
great. So next time we'll talk about Pyrrhus next time then, because it's not long. It's it's 280. Pyrrhus of Epirus comes over, so we're nearly there, very nearly there. That's probably the next big set piece series of events, right?
Yeah.
Is the Pyrrhic incursions.
Pyrrhic incursion and Telamon are really the next big things. Yeah.
Okay.